There is a particular kind of afternoon light that falls through the tall windows of old money houses. It is a light that does not rush. It has been filtering through those same panes of glass for 100 years, and in that time it has learned a patient quality, a willingness to take its time crossing the room that ordinary light does not have. It comes through curtains that were expensive once, and are now faded in a way that no one has gotten around to addressing, through glass whose slight waviness reveals the age of its manufacture, and it falls slowly onto Persian carpets that are beginning to thin at the edges, onto mahogany surfaces that hold in their wood grain and their careful joinery the evidence of another century's craftsmanship, onto silver frames that need polishing, onto oil portraits of men in dark coats and women in silk who look out at the room with the composed authority of people who expected to be looked at and who received, across the generations that followed them, exactly that. The light does not judge what it illuminates. It falls on everything with the same warm patience, on the beautiful things and the worn things, on the surfaces that have been maintained and the ones that have been allowed to slip, on the evidence of wealth sustained and the evidence of wealth that has, somewhere between one generation and the next, quietly and without drama, become less than it once was. In those houses it once seemed that there was nothing that could become less. There was time and there was money, and both seemed to possess the same inexhaustible quality as the light through the windows, permanent, reliable, continuing without particular effort on anyone's part, simply there in the way that the foundation of a house is there, requiring no daily attention, simply present beneath everything. This is a story about what happens to that certainty, about the women who inherited it and held it as long as they could, and then in the particular human ways of people who love freely, and give freely, and trust without the tools that trust requires, let it diminish. It is not a story of cruelty or of selfishness. It is something more interesting than either of those things. It is a story about love, and about the education that was never given, and about the long, quiet cost of keeping certain people out of certain rooms. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand how a great fortune falls apart, you must first understand how it was built. And building fortunes in the latter half of the 19th century in America was a very particular kind of work. Not quiet work, not gentle work. It was the work of men who rose before the sun and sat in the specific darkness of early morning with their accounts and their correspondence and the calculations that never quite left them, even when they set the paper down. Men who travelled by railroad for days at a stretch, watching the landscape of an unfinished country move past the window and seeing in it not beauty exactly, but possibility. Always possibility. The freight that could move through those valleys, the timber in those hills, the coal beneath that ground, the city that would certainly grow at that junction of rivers, and would need, when it grew, the goods and the infrastructure and the financial instruments that a man positioned correctly could provide. The men who built the great American fortunes of the Gilded Age were, with remarkably few exceptions, self-invented. They came from Ohio farms and Pennsylvania mining towns, and the crowded, fragrant, occasionally desperate immigrant neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan and Baltimore and Philadelphia. They came without pedigree and sometimes without formal education, and almost always without money, carrying instead a quality of attention to the world around them that most people did not have or did not apply with the same relentless consistency. They saw the angle that others missed. They understood, before the newspapers understood it, and before the investment houses understood it, what was going to happen in the next 10 years and how the man who positioned himself correctly in the next 2 would be the man who owned the next 10. They were not sentimental men, as a rule. They were hard in the way that self-made men of that era were hard. Not cruel, not cold, but durably committed to the project of building something that would last, and willing to absorb setbacks that would stop other men and continue forward. Because continuing forward was the only strategy they had ever had. A man who stops permanently. A man who continues at least has the possibility of arriving. This was the philosophy, rarely articulated, that underlay the 30 and 40 years of building that produced the great American fortunes. And the fortunes were, by any standard of their era or any other, great. $10 million, $20 million, $50 million. In a period when the average American labourer earned between $300 and $400 in a year, these sums existed in a different universe of comprehension, not just as larger amounts of money, but as a different relationship to money entirely, as different from ordinary wealth as a mountain is from a hill. You could not simply scale up your understanding of smaller sums and arrive at an understanding of these. They required a different kind of thinking. The men who possessed them understood this. They understood it because they had done the building, because they had stood at the various stages of accumulation and felt the way each level of wealth changed what was possible, changed the risks you could absorb and the ventures you could undertake and the adversaries you could face without flinching. They understood the money in the particular intimate way of people who have made a thing themselves, who have felt it accumulate in increments, who have known its absence and its presence both. And then they built houses, not houses in the sense that the word usually implies, shelter, warmth, a place to sleep and eat and be with one's family in the ordinary rhythms of ordinary life. What the great Gilded Age fortunes built along Fifth Avenue in New York, along Bellevue Avenue in Newport, along Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, along Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, along the lakefront drives of Chicago and the hilltops of San Francisco, those were architectural statements of a very particular and very deliberate kind. They were built in the formal vocabulary of European palaces and Renaissance villas and French chateaux, in limestone and marble and the finest woods that money could import, with ballrooms that ran the full length of floors, with libraries that required rolling ladders to reach the upper shelves and that held on those shelves thousands of volumes acquired in the understanding that a library of substance required filling, with conservatories where orchids grew through the winter mornings and where women of the household went in the afternoon to read and think and be, for a little while, alone. These houses said several things at once, and the men who built them intended every word. They said, "We have arrived, and the arriving is permanent." They said, "Our name belongs in stone, not just in account books." They said, "The generation that comes after us will live here as we lived here, and the generation after that, and the stone will still be standing, and the family inside it will still be the family inside it 100 years from now." They were also, and the builders understood this perfectly and had designed it into the very conception of the thing, inheritance machines. Every room was conceived not for the generation that occupied it, but for the generations that would follow. The silver was monogrammed with the family initial, a gesture that assumed the family would persist in a form recognizable enough to use monogrammed silver. The portraits were commissioned from painters of the first rank, because paintings of quality were meant to endure. The men in their dark coats and the women in their silk needed to endure in image, as the fortune endured in capital. The family crests, some old, some invented, with the enthusiasm of new money, most somewhere between the two, were carved into the stone lintels above doors that were built to open and close for a century. The money that built all of this was never meant to be spent. Not in the way that spending means using something up, converting it into pleasures or necessities that leave nothing behind. The principle was the engine. What you spent was the income, the dividends, the interest, the rental income from the commercial properties, the royalties from the patents, the freight revenue from the railroad lines. You did not touch the engine. The engine ran indefinitely if it was not abused. The income it produced sustained the household, the social obligations, the charitable giving, the smaller luxuries that marked a family of position from a family merely of comfort. And if you managed the engine with the patience and the discipline that the engine required, it would continue to run, would continue to produce, would sustain not just the generation that inherited it, but the one that followed and the one that followed that. This was the theory. It was a sound theory, as theories go. It was the theory that the builders had operated on in building, and it had proved correct in the building. Patience and discipline and the refusal to touch the principle had generated over 30 and 40 working years the fortunes that the houses were built to celebrate. The theory should have sustained those fortunes forward with the same reliability. What the theory did not fully account for was what would happen when the fortune passed to someone who had not been part of the building, who had lived inside the fortune during the building, in the houses and the social life and the domestic comfort that the fortune generated, but who had not sat with the accounts in the early morning darkness, or watched the quarterly returns, or had the conversations with the banker about what the long horizon required, who had been present at every dinner where the business relationships were cultivated, who had managed the household that made those dinners possible, who had been, in the social architecture of the family's professional life, essential, but who had been essential in the domestic and the social sense, not the financial one. The women who inherited the great Gilded Age fortunes were not, as a rule, unprepared for life. They were prepared for most of it in ways that were genuinely impressive. Educated in the continental manner, accomplished in languages and music and the management of complex social situations, experienced in the running of large households, capable of the kind of warm and intelligent public life that the social world of their class demanded, and that many of them, in fact, preferred to the more private arrangements of ordinary domestic existence. They were prepared for the life that the fortune supported. They were not prepared for the fortune itself. The distinction matters enormously, and it is the distinction that most family histories of the Gilded Age either overlook or treat as a minor footnote, when it is, in fact, the central drama. Knowing how to live inside a fortune is not the same as knowing how to manage one. The difference is the difference between knowing how to drive through a city and knowing how to maintain the engine of the vehicle you are driving. The first requires the second to remain possible. The second does not occur to you as a question as long as the engine continues to run. It is only when the engine begins to fail that you discover you do not know what is under the hood. The fortune begins to fail slowly. This is the most important fact about how it happens, and the fact that makes it most difficult to see in time. It does not fail all at once, not in a bankruptcy, not in a single catastrophic decision, not in anything that announces itself clearly enough to be unambiguously addressed. It fails in the way that anything large fails when it is diminished in small amounts, gradually and without drama, and in increments that seem, taken individually, entirely manageable. The first year of widowhood is expensive. Everyone understands this, and the expense is forgiven. The grief, the disruption, the social obligations that attend the death of a man of position, these generate real costs, costs that no one expects the widow to manage carefully in the middle of mourning. In the first year, the estate sustains without question whatever the household requires. This is appropriate. This is what the estate was built to do. In the second year, the costs are slightly lower, because the exceptional costs of the first year, the funeral, the legal fees, the gifts and the hospitality associated with death, those are behind her now. But the ordinary costs remain because the household remains, and the household is the same size it has always been, with the same staff and the same obligations and the same seasonal requirements and the same social life, slightly quieter perhaps than it was during the husband's active years, but still present, still real, still requiring what it has always required. In the third year, these costs feel normal. They feel like what life costs, because this is what her life has cost for 30 years, and there is no internal signal that suggests anything has changed in the structure of the situation, rather than simply in the particular items of expenditure. The household is intact. The accounts seem to be functioning. The quarterly meeting with the banker is a little uncomfortable, perhaps, in the way that any meeting about something you do not entirely understand is uncomfortable. But there is nothing in the banker's manner that suggests emergency, and he is, after all, a professional who has managed these accounts for 20 years and who clearly knows his business. What the widow cannot see, in the third year or the fifth year or the eighth year, because she has not been given the framework to see it, is the pattern. The pattern that the quarterly statements taken together and compared over time reveal clearly to anyone who has been trained to read them. The pattern of small annual deficits, the household spending slightly more each year than the estate generates in income, the difference being covered by drawing on the principal, the drawing on the principal reducing the income-generating base, the reduction in the base requiring slightly larger draws the following year to maintain the same level of expenditure. It is the arithmetic of diminishment, patient and precise, and entirely invisible to someone who has not been shown how to read it. And the women who inherited the great Gilded Age fortunes had not, in almost every case, been shown how to read it. They had been kept, with the greatest affection and the most complete good intentions, out of the room where such reading happened, and they arrived at their inheritances without the ability to see what was there to be seen. The houses on the avenues told the story, eventually, but they told it in the language of small things, and the language of small things is a language that can be ignored for a long time if you have reasons to ignore it. The staff that decreased from 20 to 15 was about the difficulty of finding good help, which was a genuine difficulty in those years and a plausible explanation. The closed rooms were being aired or renovated, or simply unnecessary in a household of 1 rather than 6. The gardens maintained by 2 men rather than 12 were still respectable gardens, still clearly cared for, even if the particular elaboration of 12 skilled men had given way to the more modest care of 2. The silver polished monthly rather than weekly was still polished silver. The dinners of 20 rather than 40 were still elegant dinners. Each small thing was individually explicable. The pattern they made together, if you were paying attention, and if you had the framework to interpret what the pattern meant, that pattern was a different story from any of the individual things. It was the story of the engine running on its reserve, the principle being consumed, the inheritance diminishing in the particular quiet way that all diminishment occurs when no one is watching it carefully enough to intervene. By the time the pattern became undeniable, by the time the estate attorney had to say what the documents had been saying for years, by the time the children sat in the lawyer's office and heard the number that did not match the number they had expected, by that time the diminishment was not a small thing that could be corrected with modest adjustments. It was the accumulated result of years of small things, added together in the patient arithmetic that no one had been watching. It was the fortune that had been meant to last a century, arrived at the third generation as a fraction of what the first generation had built, and somewhere in a room with tall windows the afternoon light fell on the Persian carpet that was beginning to show its age, and on the portrait above the mantel, and on the letter from the banker that had been sitting on the table, unopened for 2 weeks. In 1875, the daughters of the great American fortunes were receiving an education that was, by every standard their world applied to itself, excellent. It was conducted in nurseries and schoolrooms attended by governesses who spoke French without accent and German with authority, who taught piano with the expectation of genuine musicianship rather than social accomplishment, who took the education of their charges seriously in the particular way of professionals who understood that the daughters of railroad men and shipping magnates and real estate speculators would grow into women of position who were expected to hold that position with something more than inherited wealth behind them. The education was real. It produced women who were genuinely accomplished in the things it addressed. What it did not address was everything on the other side of a very specific and very consistently maintained door. The door was not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. In every house of the era that has been documented with any thoroughness, there was a study or an office or a library that served as the room where financial business was conducted, where the accounts were reviewed, where the banker visited, where the investments were discussed and the quarterly returns were read, and the long horizon calculations were made that determined the difference between a fortune sustained across generations and one that diminished in the hands of the people who inherited it. The door to that room was the boundary between the domestic world and the financial world, between the sphere in which the women of the household had authority and the sphere in which they did not. The women did not go through that door. This was not, in most cases, because they were explicitly forbidden. It was because the implicit conventions of their world made their entry unnecessary, inappropriate, and, in the social register that those conventions maintained, faintly embarrassing to everyone involved. A woman who entered the study to ask her husband about the quarterly returns was, by the standards of her class and her era, a woman who was implying that she did not trust her husband's management of what was, legally and conventionally, his domain. A woman who asked her family banker too many specific questions was a woman who was behaving in a way that suggested she might, under certain circumstances, want to manage things herself. Neither of these implications was comfortable, neither was encouraged, and so the women learned other things. They learned French and German. They learned the piano to a standard that many of them genuinely enjoyed. They learned watercolour and art history in sufficient depth to hold informed conversations about what they had seen in the galleries of Paris and Florence. They learned the specific social skills that the world they inhabited required in abundance, how to manage a dinner party of 40 with different social registers in attendance and make every guest feel appropriately seen, how to write a letter that conveyed warmth without over-familiarity, how to navigate the intricate hierarchies of a summer season in Newport or Bar Harbor without giving offence to anyone whose offence would matter. They also learned the domestic management of large households in considerable practical detail. This was real work and real skill, the organisation of a staff of 20 or 25, the hierarchy, the specific responsibilities of each position, the channels through which instructions were given, and concerns raised and disputes resolved, required genuine administrative ability. The planning of menus for formal dinners of 30 or 40 guests, accounting for dietary preferences and seasonal availability, and the social implications of what appeared on the table and in what order, required a kind of systematic thinking that is often underestimated. The household accounts, in the domestic sense, the cook's weekly provisions, the flowers, the laundry, the smaller repairs, Those required regular attention and a reasonable facility with numbers applied to manageable sums. This was what was taught, and it was not nothing. The women it produced were, in the domains it addressed, genuinely capable. They ran their households with efficiency. They managed their social lives with skill. They raised their children, entertained the world, sustained the charitable involvements that their position required, and did all of this with a quality of energy and intelligence that deserves recognition. But they were managing the life the fortune supported, not the fortune itself. And the life and the fortune were connected in the way that the surface of a river and the current beneath it are connected. You could navigate the surface expertly for 30 years without ever knowing anything about what moved beneath it, as long as the current continued to carry you in the right direction. It was only when the current changed, or when the navigation of the surface required some understanding of what was below it, that the absence of that knowledge became costly. The absence was designed into the situation. Not maliciously. The men who maintained the convention of the closed door were not, as a rule, men who were deliberately undermining the women in their households. They were men who had absorbed, from the world they lived in, the conviction that financial matters were appropriately male, and domestic matters appropriately female, and that this division served everyone well. The woman was protected from the stress of financial complexity. The man was protected from the discomfort of a wife who questioned his financial decisions. The arrangement had a long history and a self-sustaining logic that no one needed to articulate because everyone understood it without articulation. The consequence, that the women who would eventually inherit the fortunes were entirely unprepared to manage them, was not intended. It was the byproduct of a convention that served present purposes without being examined for its effects on the future. The men who maintained it had been planning for the future in every other domain, in the structures of their trusts, in the terms of their wills, in the advisors they appointed, and the letters of instruction they left behind. They had simply not planned for the possibility that the planning itself might be insufficient if the person inheriting the estate did not have the framework to execute it. Consider the situation of a woman we'll call Mrs. T, a woman of Boston, the daughter of a hardware manufacturer and the wife of a man in the shipping trade. A woman of 62 who had been widowed for 11 years at the point when her banker finally said to her, with the calm and the directness of a man who had exhausted all more gentle approaches, that the estate was in a condition that required her to make decisions she had been declining to make for a decade. She was, by every account that survives of her, an intelligent woman. She was not a woman who avoided difficulty, or who was in the habit of refusing to look at unpleasant facts. She had managed her household with real capability for 30 years. She had navigated the social life of a moderately prominent Boston family with a grace that her friends admired, and that her children, in their adult recollections, consistently cited as one of her most notable qualities. She was not a foolish woman. She was not an incurious one. She was a woman who had never, in the 62 years of her life, been asked to think about money in the way that money, when you are responsible for a large amount of it, requires you to think about it. She had never been asked to understand the relationship between the principal of an estate and the income it generated, to think about that relationship over a long time horizon, to calculate what a given rate of annual expenditure meant for the estate's condition in 10 or 15 or 20 years. These were not things that her education had addressed, because her education had been designed for the life she was expected to live, and the life she was expected to live did not include being solely responsible for the management of a substantial fortune. When her husband died and that responsibility fell to her, she received from her lawyer a careful explanation of what she'd inherited and how it was structured. She received from her banker periodic reviews of the estate's condition. She attended these reviews with genuine intention to understand what was being said, and she understood it at the level of comprehension that the vocabulary of the explanations allowed. She understood that she had inherited a significant sum. She understood that the sum generated income. She understood that the income was what she was supposed to live on. What she did not understand, what the explanations, however carefully crafted, could not quite convey to someone without the underlying framework, was the full meaning of the word supposed. She did not understand that spending slightly more than the income each year was not a trivial difference, because the shortfall came from the principal, and the reduction in the principal reduced the income, and the reduction in the income increased the proportion of spending that exceeded it, in the quiet compounding arithmetic of diminishment that operated entirely below the level of her daily experience of the household. For 11 years this arithmetic operated. The household ran. The quarterly statements arrived and were reviewed in meetings that she attended faithfully. The banker expressed concern in language that was as clear as professional politeness allowed, and she heard the concern and agreed that she would be careful and did not change the fundamental pattern of how she spent, because the fundamental pattern of how she spent was the fundamental pattern of how she had lived for 30 years, and changing it required seeing it as a pattern rather than as simply the natural cost of her life. The natural cost of her life, she discovered in the banker's office in the 11th year, had been somewhat more than the estate could sustain. This was the cost of the education they were never given, not calculated in the figures of a single estate, which could be examined and grieved and eventually accepted, but calculated across all the estates, across all the women, across all the years of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, in which the convention of the closed door produced, with the reliability of any convention that is faithfully maintained, the outcome it was always going to produce. Women who were prepared for everything except the thing they would eventually be required to do. Fortunes that were built with the intention of lasting forever, and that lasted, in too many cases, barely long enough for the generation that inherited them to discover, in the offices of lawyers who had seen it all before, how much shorter than forever turned out to be. There is a particular grief that attaches to these stories. It is different from the grief of deliberate waste, which has a moral clarity that this does not have. The women who diminished the great Gilded Age fortunes were not, in almost any case, women who were being reckless or self-indulgent or careless in the ordinary meaning of the word. They were women who were doing what they had always done, in the way they had always done it, with the good intentions and the genuine love and the complete absence of the specific knowledge that might have changed the outcome. They were failed not by themselves, but by the system that formed them, and the system that formed them was maintained by people who believed, quite sincerely, that they were doing everyone a favour. The door stayed closed. The education was not given. The fortunes diminished in the particular way of things that diminish, when no one who understands their structure is watching over them. And the light continued to fall through the tall windows of those houses, patient and warm and entirely indifferent to the arithmetic it was illuminating. The drawing rooms of Gilded Age society were full, in the years after a wealthy man's death, of other men. This was not a coincidence. The death of a man of significant means created, in the social physics of the era, a predictable gravitational event. A large fortune, now held by a woman who was known to be inexperienced in its management, attracted men who understood the dynamics of the situation and who were positioned, by temperament and by preparation, to respond to them. Some of these men were straightforward fortune hunters in the sense that the phrase implies, men who had identified the widow and the fortune as an opportunity, and who pursued the marriage with the deliberateness of a professional pursuing a contract. These were the easiest cases to identify and, in theory, the easiest to defend against, because their intentions were legible enough that a sufficiently alert family or a sufficiently experienced advisor could sometimes see them clearly enough to say something useful. But most of the men who married wealthy widows in the decades around the turn of the century were not that straightforward. They were, instead, something more complicated and in some ways more difficult to navigate. Men who had genuine qualities, who were genuinely charming and genuinely interested in the widow as a person, who offered the companionship and the social partnership that widowhood made genuinely necessary, and who were, at the same time, not financially what they appeared to be. Men whose social position and manner suggested a stability that their actual financial circumstances did not support. Men who needed the marriage for reasons that they may not have fully acknowledged even to themselves, because the acknowledgement would have required a kind of honest self-assessment that is always difficult, and that is particularly difficult for people who are very good at the maintenance of appearances. These men were not villains in the straightforward sense. They were not necessarily conscious schemers executing a carefully planned exploitation. They were people in a particular kind of difficulty. The difficulty of a social position maintained beyond its financial means, the difficulty of optimism in the face of evidence that should have produced pessimism, the difficulty of wanting something that required marriage to achieve, and of finding the wanting and the achievement easier to sustain if certain things were not examined too closely. The widow who married such a man was not foolish. She was typically a woman of real intelligence and real social skill, who had identified genuine qualities in the man she chose, and who had not been given the tools, by education, or by experience, or by the social conventions of her world, to look past the genuine qualities to the financial situation beneath them. The social conventions were particularly relevant here. In the world of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, direct financial inquiry about a potential husband was considered somewhere between rude and obscene. You did not ask a gentleman about his income. You did not instruct your lawyer to investigate his accounts. You trusted your impression and your friend's impressions, and the impression he made in the social settings where impressions were formed and communicated. The impression was a thing he had learned to manage. It was the one skill that his situation required above all others, and it was a skill that most men in this particular position had cultivated with considerable dedication, because the alternative, the exposure of the gap between what they appeared to be and what they were, was a social catastrophe that they could not afford. So the impression was maintained, and the impression was what the widow evaluated, and the evaluation produced, in too many cases, a second marriage that the estate would spend several years recovering from, if it could recover at all. Adelaide Pennock's situation was representative, though it was not, in its specific elements, identical to any other. She had been widowed in 1896 at the age of 52, inheriting from her husband George Pennock an estate in the neighbourhood of $3 million, built over 30 years in the Philadelphia dry goods trade. She was a woman who was considered by everyone who knew her to be intelligent and capable and entirely suitable for the management of a large household and a full social life. She was not considered, because the question had not previously arisen in a form that required consideration, to be particularly prepared for the management of $3 million. She met Reginald Claridge in the spring of 1899, introduced at a dinner by a mutual acquaintance who described him as a man of solid means, with interest in Pennsylvania coal. He was 49, he was well presented, he was knowledgeable on enough subjects to sustain conversation across the range of topics that a Philadelphia dinner party in 1899 was likely to address. He listened with the specific quality of attention that certain men develop, which is the quality of attention that makes the person being listened to feel that what they are saying is the most interesting thing the listener has heard all evening. Adelaide found him pleasant company in a period that had not had much pleasant company in it. What she did not find, because she did not look, and the conventions of her world did not invite looking, was his actual financial situation. The Pennsylvania coal interests had not been interests of any significance for approximately 4 years. The company that had formed the basis of his earlier prosperity had been sold under conditions that were more pressured than they were advertised as being. His current position, the house, the club memberships, the social engagements, was sustained by the kind of careful management of appearances that requires considerable energy, and that becomes, after a certain point, not so much a deliberate strategy as simply the only way of operating that a person knows. They married in the autumn of 1899. The legal arrangements governing the marriage were drawn up by lawyers on both sides, and the arrangements were not as protective of Adelaide's interests as they might have been, for reasons that were structural and social rather than individual. The lawyers who represented her were men of competence and good intention, who operated within the conventions of their world. And within those conventions the expectation was that a husband would manage marital finances, and the documents they produced while preserving certain specific assets in Adelaide's name gave Claridge a level of access to and authority over the estate that proved, in the event, to be more than his judgment could responsibly exercise. The first 2 years gave no obvious indication of difficulty. This was not because Claridge was concealing things in those years, or not primarily. It was because the investment decisions he was making in those years had not yet produced the results that would eventually require concealment. He invested in a railroad extension in western Pennsylvania that seemed, in 1900, to have sound fundamentals. He invested in a silver concern in Nevada that was producing promising early results. He shifted the estate's management to advisors he had relationships with, which was a change Adelaide agreed to because Claridge had explained the benefits of the new arrangement in terms that seemed reasonable, and because the old arrangement had been George Pennock's choice rather than hers, and George Pennock was gone. The results of these changes accumulated slowly, as the results of poor investment decisions usually accumulate. The railroad extension encountered terrain difficulties and political opposition that were not anticipated in the initial projections, and that required additional capital to address, capital that had not been budgeted, and that came from the estate. The silver concern's early production figures were not sustained. The advisors Claridge preferred were not more skilled than the ones they had replaced. They were more amenable to the kind of aggressive repositioning that Claridge favoured, and their fees were higher. None of this appeared in the household. The household continued exactly as it had. This was possible because the losses in the early years were absorbed by drawing on principal in amounts that left the household operation undisturbed. The drawing on principal was not invisible. It appeared in the estate accounts, but the estate accounts were reviewed in meetings that Adelaide attended in the company of Claridge, and in those meetings the explanations provided for the changes in the account balances were the explanations that Claridge provided. Adjustments related to market conditions, strategic repositioning for long-term strength, temporary drawdowns associated with investment timelines. Adelaide heard these explanations and found them, if not entirely comprehensible, at least not clearly alarming. They had the texture of financial expertise, specific enough to suggest knowledge, framed in terms that implied the situation was under control by someone who understood it. She had not been given the tools to evaluate them independently. She had the impression of competence, maintained with skill, and she held the impression. The letter arrived on a morning in the spring of 1905, addressed to Claridge, which she opened before she noticed the name. It was from a creditor. It named a debt that she had not known existed. It named assets held as collateral that she had not known were committed. It was written in the formal professional language of a creditor who is being civil, but whose civility is a thin membrane over an impatience that the formal language is barely containing. She read it twice. She put it on the desk in Claridge's study where he would find it on his return from New York. She said nothing when he returned, waiting to see whether he would raise it. He did not. After 3 days she raised it herself at dinner, in the direct and composed manner that she had adopted for conversations she anticipated would be difficult. The explanation he gave was lengthy and fluent and partially true. The market conditions of the preceding years had been genuinely difficult. Some of what had gone wrong was legitimately attributable to circumstances no one had controlled. Some of what had gone wrong had been the product of decisions that had seemed sound and had not proved to be, which was the nature of investment risk. Some of what had gone wrong, the smallest part of the explanation, offered carefully, framed as the exception rather than the rule, had been errors of judgment that he was prepared to own. She accepted the explanation more than she should have, because accepting it was more comfortable than the alternative, and because she was, at 59, less inclined to overturn her life for the sake of a clarity that she was not certain would feel better than the managed uncertainty she currently inhabited. She stayed. Another letter arrived the following year. This one was less civil. This one she did not wait to show Claridge. She took it instead to a lawyer her daughter's husband had recommended, a man named Harrington who was, she had been told, direct without being unkind and thorough without being theatrical. Harrington spent 3 weeks with the estate documents. Then he presented Adelaide with an accounting that was, in its precision, unlike anything she had been shown before. It showed her the estate as George Pennock had left it in 1896. It showed her the estate as it stood in the spring of 1906. The distance between those two columns of figures was approximately $2,100,000. Of that amount, something over $800,000 was attributable to investment losses and management fees associated with Claridge's financial decisions. The rest was attributable to the ordinary expenses of 7 years of widowhood and a second marriage. She understood it. Not in the approximate way she had understood previous accountings, in the full way, the specific way, the way that a number has when the framework for understanding it is finally present. $2,100,000 in 7 years. 3 million had become something under $1 million, and she was 60 years old. She began divorce proceedings in 1907. They were expensive and contested and conducted over 2 years in the formal language of legal argument that addressed the financial specifics without addressing the human ones, which was probably appropriate because the human ones were not things that could be resolved in a courtroom. In 1909 the divorce was granted. Claridge received a settlement that was modest by Harrington's negotiating, and still substantial relative to what remained of the estate. He left Philadelphia. Adelaide moved to a smaller house with fewer staff and a banker she had chosen herself, and a relationship to the quarterly statements that was, for the first time in her life, genuinely engaged. Her children received eventually what was left. It was enough in the practical sense. It was not what their father had intended when he spent 30 years building what he built. The women of the Gilded Age gave. This was not incidental to their lives or peripheral to their identities. It was central as the social life that the giving accompanied and sometimes exceeded, as central as the management of the household, or the raising of the children, or the maintenance of the marriages that were the primary organizational principle of their existence. They gave with real consistency and real commitment, and in many cases, real effectiveness. The hospitals they funded, the orphanages they supported, the settlement houses they helped sustain, those institutions were real, and the people they served were real, and the difference the giving made in specific lives was not diminished by anything complicated in the financial story that surrounded it. What was complicated, and it was genuinely complicated, not a matter of simple moral judgment, was the relationship between the giving and the inheritance that the giving reduced. The women who gave most freely, most generously, most consistently across the years of their widowhood were often the women who left their children the least. The generosity and the diminishment were not accidental companions. They were connected by the arithmetic of an estate managed without sufficient attention to the relationship between what it generated and what it gave away. The connection is not a comfortable one to state plainly, because it sits at the intersection of two things that we're inclined to treat as separate: the genuine good of charitable work and the genuine harm of a depleted inheritance. The charitable work was genuinely good, the depletion was genuinely harmful. Both of these things were true simultaneously, without either cancelling the other, and the only way to understand the stories of these women is to hold both in view at the same time and resist the temptation to let one resolve the other. Eleanor Whitmore's case is the most thoroughly documented precisely because her family was most thorough in preserving the records. She had been widowed in 1891, inheriting from her husband Thomas Whitmore an estate of approximately $2,100,000, built over 35 years in the wholesale dry goods trade in New York. Thomas had been a careful man with money, conservative in his investments, attentive to the details of the estate's management in the way that successful men of his type were attentive. The estate at his death was sound. The income it generated was sufficient for the life Eleanor had lived, and was intended to remain sufficient for the life she would live afterward. Eleanor had been involved in charitable work for more than 20 years before Thomas's death. She sat on the boards of 2 women's hospitals that were understaffed and underfunded in the way of women's hospitals of that era, which is to say chronically and persistently. She was deeply involved with a settlement house on the west side of Manhattan that served a population of recent immigrants, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, who were arriving in New York in numbers that the existing social infrastructure was not equipped to absorb without significant supplementary support. She was a regular contributor to a school for immigrant children on the Lower East Side, to a domestic servants training society that she had helped found in 1880, to a library in Harlem that was struggling to expand its collection to meet the needs of a growing community. These were serious long-term involvements, not the casual charitable associations of a woman who wanted to have her name on a plaque. She had given real time and real attention to these institutions for years. She knew the directors and the staff. She knew, in the particular way of someone who visits and engages rather than simply donates, the specific needs of the specific populations these institutions served. She cared about the work in the deepest sense of the word. It was the work she had chosen to do with the capacities she had beyond the domestic, and she had done it with the same intelligence and commitment she brought to everything she valued. When Thomas died and she inherited $2 million, Eleanor understood this inheritance as, among other things, a release from the constraint that had always limited her giving. The constraint had been practical. Her charitable donations during the marriage had come from her personal allowance, which was generous but finite, and the finitude had meant making choices, and making choices had meant that many needs she could see clearly went unaddressed for lack of funds. Now there were funds. Now there were more funds than she had ever imagined having for this purpose. She began giving almost immediately. In the first year she gave approximately $120,000, distributed across the institutions she already supported, and several new ones that her expanded resources made it possible to consider. The amount was, in her understanding of the situation, a reasonable proportion of what she had. A large gift, certainly, but from a large estate, and an estate that was, she believed, large enough to absorb it without structural consequence. The estate's income in that first year was approximately $90,000. The shortfall between what she gave and what the estate generated, $30,000, was covered by the principal. The principal, slightly reduced, would generate slightly less income the following year. Eleanor did not know this, not because the information was hidden from her, but because the framework that would have allowed her to extract the relevant meaning from the information she was given did not exist in her, had not been built there by education or experience. She reviewed the estate accounts in quarterly meetings with her banker, Aldrich, and she found in those reviews confirmation that the estate was functional that the accounts were being managed, that things were proceeding in the appropriate channels. She could not find, with the tools she had, the specific significance of the year-on-year reduction in the principal, and what that reduction meant projected across 20 years. Aldrich tried to show her. He tried with patience and with considerable skill at translation. The translation from the technical language of financial management to the plain language of consequence. He talked about stewardship. He talked about the estate's long-term health. He constructed specific projections showing what the estate would look like in 5 years and in 10 if the current giving rate continued. He presented these projections in meetings that Eleanor attended with genuine attention, and from which she departed each time with what she described as a renewed commitment to being more careful. The renewed commitment expressed itself in 1893 as a donation to the settlement house for $25,000. The settlement house needed a new furnace before winter. The families who relied on the settlement house's facilities would suffer real cold if the furnace was not replaced. The $25,000 was not, to Eleanor, a choice between the estate's long-term health and a furnace. It was a choice between a furnace and no furnace, and the furnace was necessary, and she had $25,000, and the situation resolved itself in the only way that was morally possible for a woman who was looking at it the way Eleanor was looking at it. This was how it went year after year for 23 years. The giving was never arbitrary. It was always in response to real needs, identified through real relationships with real institutions. The orphanage needed a new roof. The hospital needed additional beds. The school needed a full-time administrator. These were real needs, and Eleanor had money, and the money addressed the needs, and the estate was reduced by the amount of the address and grew less capable of sustaining the next year's giving at the same level, and the giving was sustained anyway because the needs did not diminish in proportion to the estate's diminishment. Her eldest son came to see her in 1897 with charts. He was a careful man, working in insurance in New York, and he had obtained from Aldrich the quarterly statements going back to his father's death, and had constructed from them a projection that he found deeply concerning. The projection showed the estate's condition in 10 years if nothing changed, and the condition was significantly less than what the estate had been when Thomas died. Eleanor looked at the charts. She engaged with her son's concern with the seriousness she brought to everything that came from someone she loved and trusted. She said she understood and would think carefully and was grateful for his attention to the matter. She did not say, because she did not know she would need to say it until years later, that the framework for his concern, the 10-year horizon, the rate of principal reduction, the compounding effect of diminishing income, was not a framework she could fully inhabit. It was a framework she could observe from the outside, the way you observe a conversation in a language you do not speak. She could see that something important was being said. She could not quite make it mean what it needed to mean for it to change her behaviour. She died in 1914, and the estate she left was approximately $240,000. Her son, examining the final accounting, found that she had given away in 23 years approximately $1,400,000 in charitable donations. The rest had been absorbed by the ordinary expenses of her life. The $2,100,000 that Thomas had built had become $240,000 through the specific mechanism of a generous woman giving without the tools to calculate what her giving, at the rate she gave it, meant for the estate's capacity to sustain her and to eventually pass to her children. The institutions she had supported received nothing further from her estate and had to reckon with the abrupt absence of what they had, perhaps, been relying upon too heavily. Her children divided what was left with the quiet equity of people for whom the amount, though smaller than expected, is still not nothing. The plaque on the East Side Church acknowledges the reading room. It is accurate. It is also, in the way of all plaques, incomplete. The conversation that needed to happen, the direct, frank, early conversation about the estate's actual condition and the trajectory its management was producing, that conversation was not had in most of these families until the information it would have conveyed had already been overtaken by events. It was not had because on the side of the parent, the combination of pride and denial and magical thinking, and the genuine difficulty of making herself the subject of financial examination by her own children made it nearly impossible to initiate. And on the side of the children, the combination of love and loyalty, and the social conventions of a world where children did not audit their parents, made it nearly impossible to demand. And so the information that was essential to the children's understanding of their own futures, the information that would have allowed them to plan, or to adjust their expectations, or at least to understand what was happening before they arrived in the lawyer's office and heard a number that did not match the number they had been, implicitly or explicitly, led to expect. That information accumulated in the files of bankers and lawyers who were bound by professional constraint and relationship loyalty from transmitting it uninvited, and it waited there, patient as the light through the tall windows, until the moment of the estate's settlement made its transmission unavoidable. The Massachusetts family of Jonathan Harrington, the shoe manufacturer, the man of modest origins and extraordinary application, who had built a fortune of $1,800,000 over the 30 years of his working life, and who had died in 1889 leaving it to his widow Margaret and their 4 children, provides one of the more thorough documentations of this particular pattern, because the eldest son, who worked in banking in Chicago, kept a careful private journal, and because his journals have been partially preserved. Jonathan's 4 children ranged in age at his death from 19 to 28. The eldest son, William, was 28 and already working in banking. The second child, Alice, was 25 and living in Boston, recently married. The third child, Frances, was 22 and living at home with her mother. The youngest, Robert, was 19 and at college. They knew their father had been a successful man. They knew the family was prosperous. They'd grown up in a house that was large and well-maintained and staffed by people who were reliable and well-treated, and the house had continued to be all of these things after Jonathan's death, which their mother managed with the competence that everyone agreed was one of her most conspicuous qualities. She was an organized woman. She was a careful woman. She had managed the household with real efficiency for 30 years. It did not occur to any of her children to doubt that she was managing the estate with the same efficiency. William, who was closest by temperament and by profession to the relevant framework, had his first moment of specific concern in 1893, when he visited Boston for a week in July and noticed, during that week, 3 things that he recorded in his journal. The garden crew that had maintained the grounds at the house since his childhood was, he observed, smaller than it had been, 2 men rather than the 4 he remembered. A room on the 3rd floor that had always been a guest bedroom was closed and being used for storage. His mother mentioned, in passing, that she had been thinking of reducing the frequency of her Newport summers. He recorded these observations and noted that each was individually explicable. Labour was harder to find and more expensive. The guest room was genuinely not needed. A quieter summer was appropriate for a woman of his mother's age and position. He did not press. He did not ask his mother directly about the estate's condition. He was 29 years old, and he was, despite his banking work, still his mother's son, and asking his mother directly about the estate's condition was not something the structure of his relationship with her naturally accommodated. He asked his sister Alice instead, in a letter written in August 1893, framing his inquiry as general family concern rather than specific financial suspicion. Alice replied that she had noticed similar things, but had no specific information about the estate's condition, and that she was inclined, absent specific reason for alarm, to assume that their mother's management was sound. The assumption was comfortable, and the assumption was maintained. William recorded in his journal, in the fall of 1893, that he had decided not to pursue the matter further unless something more specifically alarming came to his attention. He was aware, he noted, that the decision was partly the product of not wanting to upset his mother, and partly the product of not wanting to disturb an understanding of the family's situation that was, as long as it was undisturbed, still reassuring. Nothing more specifically alarming came to his attention for 7 years. The house in Boston continued to be the house in Boston. His mother continued to entertain, modestly. She continued to visit the properties she visited, and to give to the charities she gave to, and to correspond with the people she corresponded with. The surface of the family's life was intact. The surface continued to be intact for 7 years, and in those 7 years the pattern beneath the surface continued without interruption, because patterns do not pause while the people they affect choose not to look at them. Frances, the 3rd child who lived closest to her mother and visited most frequently, was the one who tracked the small things with the most consistent attention. She recorded them privately, not in a journal, but in the specific particular way that daughters of careful mothers sometimes develop, the habit of noticing the detail that signals the larger thing. The flowers on the dining room table were smaller this year than last year, and from the kitchen garden rather than a florist. The tablecloth at Christmas dinner was the second best tablecloth rather than the best tablecloth. The regular cook had been replaced by a less expensive one, and the meals were adequate rather than excellent, and their mother had offered no explanation for the change. Frances did not say anything. She was not in a position to say anything, in the specific sense that the structure of her relationship with her mother did not provide a channel through which the observation could be converted into inquiry, without becoming something that felt like a challenge to her mother's authority and her mother's self-presentation. She loved her mother. She did not want to wound her. She held the observations privately and continued to visit and to hold what she saw alongside the assumption that things were essentially fine, because the assumption was warmer than the alternative. William came to Boston in 1902 with the specific intention of having the conversation. He was 39 by this point, and something, the accumulation of the small things he had noticed on visits, a comment from the family banker made at a social occasion in a way that suggested concern the banker was trying not to express too directly, had shifted the balance of his calculation from the discomfort of asking to the discomfort of not knowing, and the discomfort of not knowing had become the greater of the two. He prepared for it carefully. He did not bring charts. He had decided charts would feel confrontational. He brought himself and the intention to ask directly but gently about the estate's condition, and to listen to whatever his mother said, and to follow up in whatever direction the conversation went. His mother told him that things were fine. She said it with the warmth and the composure that had characterized everything she said on this subject for 13 years. The warmth and composure of a woman who had been telling herself for 13 years that things were fine and who had, through the sustained telling, arrived at a state of genuine belief. She was not deceiving her son. She was sharing with him the understanding she had, which was the understanding of a woman managing an estate that she had never been taught to read correctly, who saw the quarterly meetings and the signed documents and the household that was still functioning, and understood these as evidence that the management was proceeding appropriately, which was true in the administrative sense and false in the substantive one. William left Boston knowing he had not accomplished what he came to accomplish, knowing that his mother was not lying and was not entirely right, knowing that the conversation that needed to happen had not happened, and that he did not know how to make it happen in a way that would produce the outcome that it needed to produce. He wrote to Frances from the train. Frances wrote back from Boston with the specificity of someone who had been tracking the details for years, and who had been waiting for someone to say out loud what she'd been seeing. The letter she wrote to William in the fall of 1902 is, in the partial record that survives of this family's correspondence, one of the most detailed and most candid documents of its kind. A daughter's careful accounting of what she had observed over many years, the inventory of small things that added up to a picture she'd been afraid to name. The naming had come too late to change anything. Their mother died in 1907. The estate was approximately $650,000, a reduction from $1,800,000 of something over $1 million in 18 years. The four children divided approximately $580,000 after the estate's costs were covered. Each received approximately $145,000. It was not nothing. William put his in the investments he managed with the specific competence of a banker who understood the difference between principal and income. Frances and Alice arranged theirs carefully, with the attentiveness of women who had been watching long enough to understand the lesson they had been watching. Robert, the youngest, who had expected the most and prepared the least, took longest to adjust. The adjustment that was hardest was not financial. It was the adjustment of understanding. The revision of the story they had told themselves about the family's situation. The revision that the estate attorney's accounting required them to make when they sat with the documents in the formal silence of his oak-panelled office. The revision that required them to understand that their mother had loved them deeply and had managed what she managed with everything she had and had arrived, through no malice and no recklessness, at a result that was the product of the specific gap between what the management required and what she had been given to bring to it. They loved her. They continued to love her. Grief does not resolve these things. It simply provides the specific quality of quiet in which the understanding has room to settle. The light fell through the windows of the estate attorney's office with the same patience it fell through every other window. It was a winter afternoon, late, the light already taking on the quality of approaching darkness that winter afternoons have in New England. Still warm in colour, but with the edge of something cooler coming, the intimation of the darkness that would follow it. The relationship between a great fortune and the house that embodied it was not incidental. The house was, in the specific understanding of the men who built these fortunes, the proof of the fortune. Not in the sense that they needed proof, not in the sense that the account books were insufficient evidence for the men themselves, but in the social sense that the world in which they moved required visible proof, proof that could be assessed at a glance from the sidewalk, proof that could be reported in the society columns of the newspapers that tracked these matters with the precision of professional appraisers. The society columns of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s described the houses of the wealthy with a detail and a specificity that modern readers find remarkable. The dimensions of the ballrooms, the cost of the imported stone, the names of the architects and the provenance of the decorative elements, the number of staff required to maintain the establishment at the standard the family's position required. This reporting was not idle curiosity on the part of the newspapers, and not vanity on the part of the families. It was the public record of the social fact that the house embodied. The house said, in a language that the entire city could read without being told the words, "This family has arrived, and the arriving is of a certain scale, and the scale is this." When a husband died and the house passed to the widow, the house continued to say these things. It continued to make the argument for the family's position even as the financial circumstances that had first justified that position began, quietly and without anyone's explicit acknowledgement, to change. The widow maintained the house in part because of what it meant to her personally. The place she had lived, the rooms where her children had been raised, the setting of her social life, and in part because of what it continued to say to the world about who she was and where she stood. Selling the house would have required not just finding a buyer and conducting a transaction, but revising the statement, saying, "We are no longer the family that lives in a house like this," and that statement, once made, could not be unmade. The houses therefore stayed. They stayed past the point at which a purely financial analysis would have recommended releasing them, past the point at which the cost of their maintenance was clearly disproportionate to the estate's income, past the point at which the staff required to maintain them at minimum acceptable standards had been reduced so far that the reduction itself was becoming a statement, not the statement the family intended, but a statement nonetheless, visible to anyone who had known the household in its prime and was paying attention to the difference. What made the staying possible, for as long as it was possible, was the combination of personal attachment and social imperative that the house represented. The widow who released the house would have needed to do two things simultaneously. She would have needed to overcome the personal grief of losing the physical place that represented her life with her husband, and she would have needed to accept the social revision that the release required. Both were significant. Either alone might have been manageable. Together they created a weight of resistance that most women of this world were not able to fully overcome until the financial situation had become not just clear, but undeniable. The undeniable moment arrived in different ways for different families, but it arrived, eventually, in every case where the estate had been managed without sufficient attention to the relationship between what it generated and what it required. It arrived in the form of a banker's letter, or a son's visit with charts, or a conversation with the estate attorney about the situation as it actually stood. And when it arrived, it required the women who faced it to do the most difficult thing in these stories, to become someone different from who they had believed they were. The houses were sold, the furniture went into storage, or to the children's smaller houses or to auction. The servants found other positions. The silver was polished one last time and then packed. The portraits were moved, some of them, to the apartments or the smaller houses, and some to institutions, and some were simply not seen again by the people who had grown up looking at them. And the houses themselves were demolished in most cases by developers who built on their sites the kind of buildings that a changing city required, taller and more efficient and without the particular quality of intention that the original buildings had embodied. The light fell on the demolition sites in exactly the same way it had fallen on the houses they replaced. Light is not interested in what it illuminates. It falls on whatever is there. The specific quality of the financial ignorance that characterized most wealthy women of the Gilded Age was not the ignorance of carelessness or of incuriosity. It was the ignorance of systematic exclusion from the domain in which the relevant knowledge was held and transmitted. The knowledge existed. It was available. It was used every day by the men who managed the estates and the bankers who reviewed the accounts and the lawyers who drafted the documents. It was simply not available to the women who would eventually need it, because the world that held it had decided, for reasons it considered adequate, that those women did not need access to it. The consequences of this decision played out across decades and across hundreds of families in ways that the decision's architects had not anticipated and would not, in most cases, have intended. They had not intended for their widows to diminish the estates they had spent lifetimes building. They had intended the opposite. They had made provisions, structured trusts, appointed advisors, written letters of instruction, all with the intention of protecting the estate from exactly the erosion that occurred. The protection failed because the protection was external to the person most responsible for the estate's management, and external protection, however well designed, is not equivalent to internal understanding. It is a scaffold around a building, not a foundation beneath it. The advisors could advise, the bankers could provide quarterly statements, the lawyers could review the decisions and note the ones that were unwise. None of them could make the decisions themselves, because the decision-making authority resided with the widow, as it properly should, and the widow could not be compelled to follow advice she had not been prepared to evaluate. She evaluated the advice with the tools she had, and the tools she had were insufficient to the evaluation, and the estate suffered the consequences of the insufficiency. There were women who escaped this. Women who had, through some combination of circumstance and personality, and the particular luck of having a husband who thought it was worth including them, developed the relevant understanding before they needed it. These women are the exceptions in the historical record, noted as exceptions by the contemporaries who observed them and by the historians who have traced their stories. They are noted as exceptions because they were exceptions, because the rule was otherwise, because the convention was strong, and the exceptions required specific circumstances to produce. The women who escaped were often women who had been curious in a way that could not be fully contained by the convention. Women who had asked questions that were, in the social register of their households, slightly too pointed to be entirely comfortable, and who had been answered reluctantly or generously depending on the husband, with information that built over time into something that functioned as understanding. Women who had been in the room during a conversation that was not intended for them, and who had retained what they overheard. Women whose husbands had died suddenly, without the preparations that a longer illness might have allowed, and who had been thrown into financial responsibility before the convention could be fully reasserted around them. These women managed their estates differently, not perfectly, no one manages perfectly, and the pressures that affected the less prepared women affected the better prepared ones too, in degrees. The son still needed things. The charitable impulse was still real. The household still cost what it cost. But the better prepared women were more likely to see the numbers, as meaningful statements about a real situation, rather than as the particular kind of abstract that a statement becomes when you do not have the framework to convert it into implication. They were more likely to act on the meaning, more likely to say, to the son, or to the charitable institution, or to the household budget, the word that mattered not yet or not now, or not at this scale or no. The word no in these families was the rarest and the most consequential word. It was rare because saying it required a clarity about the estate's situation that most of the women did not have, and because even when they had the clarity, saying it to a son you loved, or to an institution you had supported for 20 years, required a quality of resolve that was easier to maintain if you fully understood what was at stake, and very difficult to maintain if you did not. The women who said it when they needed to say it, who maintained it when it needed to be maintained, were almost always the women who understood. The women who could not quite say it, or who said it and then retreated from it, were almost always the women who did not understand clearly enough to hold the line. The closed door had consequences that extended further than any of the men who maintained it could have calculated. It extended forward in time through the lives of the women who inherited what was behind it, into the lives of the children who received less than was intended, into the generations that followed those children, into the particular shape of family after family across the decades, in ways that a different convention, a door left open, an education provided, a woman invited into the room, might have changed fundamentally. The problem of the second husband was not simply a problem of individual bad choices. It was, at a structural level, the product of two things operating simultaneously. The social convention that made independent financial inquiry about a potential husband essentially impossible, and the financial vulnerability that widowhood created for women who had not been prepared for it. The combination was reliable in its production of the specific difficulty. A woman who was managing a large estate for the first time without adequate preparation was a woman whose management would almost certainly be less than fully effective. A less than fully effective management of a large estate produced over time an estate under a certain kind of pressure, not necessarily crisis-level pressure, not the kind of pressure that announced itself clearly, but the low-level, manageable-seeming pressure of annual deficits that were individually unremarkable and cumulatively significant. A woman under this pressure, even if she did not fully perceive it as pressure, was a woman for whom the companionship and the practical partnership that a second marriage offered had genuine appeal beyond the social. A second marriage offered someone to share the weight of decisions, someone who, in theory, might provide the financial competence that the widow lacked, someone to sit in the room where the financial decisions were made, which was a room the widow had never been comfortable in, and where the presence of a confident, knowledgeable-seeming man would be a relief. The man who entered this situation as the second husband arrived with, in most cases, a competent assessment of what the situation offered and what it required. He understood that the widow had a large estate. He understood that the estate was managed without full competence. This was often visible in the small signs that a financially sophisticated observer could read, in the way the household ran, and the way the widow spoke about money, and the way she responded to certain kinds of questions. He understood that a marriage to this woman would provide him with access to resources he needed, and that his role would be to provide, in exchange, the appearance of competent management and the companionship that the widow genuinely sought. He was not always fully conscious of this calculation. In some cases, the calculation was entirely conscious and entirely cynical. In more cases, it was the kind of half-awareness that motivated behavior without being fully articulated, that allowed the man to tell himself a story about his motivations that was more flattering than the full truth would have been. He was genuinely fond of her. He did genuinely intend to manage the estate well. He genuinely believed, at the moment of each investment decision, that the investment was sound. The self-deception was real, and it was not entirely without content. There was real fondness, there was real intention, there was real optimism about the soundness of the decisions. What there was not, in the cases that ended badly, was the track record that should have preceded a man's management of a very large estate, and the specific kind of honest self-assessment that a poor track record, honestly confronted, produces. The man who had managed money well across many years, and who had encountered difficulty and revised his approach in response to difficulty, and who had arrived at an approach that had proved stable and reliable, that man was a different manager than the man who had encountered difficulty and had explained it to himself as external, temporary, and correctable with the right resources, because the resources he had previously managed were not sufficient, but these new resources, her resources, would be. The first man had been formed by difficulty. The second man had been protected from the full consequences of his difficulty by the availability of a new source of resources, which was, in the specific moment of the marriage, her estate. This distinction was not visible to the widow at the time of the marriage, because the convention of her world made financial investigation of a gentleman's track record essentially impossible, and because the distinction expressed itself, at the social level, in qualities that were not easily distinguished from their opposite. The man with the genuine track record and the man with the explained-away track record both presented as confident. Both spoke with the vocabulary of financial knowledge. Both had, in the social settings where their presentations were assessed, the same quality of manner. The difference was in the documents, in the account books, in the record of decisions made and consequences faced, and those were precisely the materials that the convention did not permit the widow to examine. Adelaide Pennock's experience was not an isolated case. Across the decades of the Gilded Age and the years that followed it, women who had inherited large estates and who had married for the second time found, at various points in the second marriage's history, that the estate's condition was not what they had believed it to be, and that the husband's management of it had been less sound than the husband's manner had suggested. The discovery came at different points. Some women discovered it early, within a year or two of the marriage, when the first significant losses became visible in the accounts. Some discovered it only when the situation had progressed past the point at which early discovery would have allowed significant course correction. The discoveries, whenever they came, shared a quality. They came after the damage was done. Not because the damage had been invisible. The accounts recorded it faithfully, the quarterly statements showed it clearly, but because the person who needed to see the damage had not been given the tools to see it, and the person who had the tools had a strong incentive not to show it, and the system that might have provided the tools was the system that had decided, long before any of these marriages took place, that the tools were not necessary for women to have. The philanthropic work that the wealthy women of the Gilded Age engaged in was, in its ambition and its practical reach, genuinely impressive by the standards of any era. The women who built and supported the hospitals and the settlement houses and the schools and the orphanages and the libraries were not simply writing checks to causes they had been told were worthy. They were, in many cases, actively involved in the management of these institutions, attending board meetings, interviewing directors, assessing programs, making decisions about priorities and resource allocation that required the same qualities of intelligence and organizational skill that any institutional manager brings to the work. The involvement was real and the engagement was real, and the knowledge that accumulated through years of deep involvement with specific institutions was the knowledge of people who understood the work from the inside, who had seen what worked and what did not, who had developed the particular kind of practical wisdom that sustained engagement with difficult problems produces. This was not trivial. The women who built these institutions were building something that required building, and they were building it with competence and with genuine care. What made the building financially complicated, and what made the stories of estates diminished through charitable giving as common as the historical record suggests they were, was the asymmetry between the intimacy of the women's knowledge of the institutions and the abstraction of their knowledge of the estates. They knew the institutions the way they knew people, specifically, in detail, with attention to the particular circumstances that determined what was needed in this moment and what was not. They knew the estates the way they knew concepts, approximately in general terms, without the specific knowledge of the numbers that would have allowed them to calculate what the giving, at the rate they gave it, meant for the estate's capacity to continue. The asymmetry was structurally produced by the same forces that produced all the other asymmetries in these stories. The intimacy with the institutions came from engagement, years of regular attendance, personal relationship, the accumulation of specific knowledge through specific experience. The abstraction of the estate knowledge came from exclusion, the convention that kept women out of the room where the financial decisions were made, the quarterly meetings that were reviews rather than discussions, the accounts that were presented rather than explored. If the estate knowledge had been as intimate as the institutional knowledge, if the widow had sat with the accounts in the same way she sat with the institution's board, with the same regularity and the same engagement and the same accumulation of specific understanding over time, the decisions about giving would have been different, not necessarily smaller, because the needs were real, and the engagement with the needs was genuine, but more calibrated, more explicitly in relationship to the estate's actual condition and actual capacity, more likely to account for the long horizon that the estate was supposed to serve, as well as the immediate horizon that the institution's need occupied. The calibration was the thing that was missing. The mechanism by which the giving related to the estate's condition was the mechanism that the education had failed to build, and in the absence of that mechanism, the giving and the condition operated independently, the giving at the rate that the needs and the compassion and the relationships required, the condition at the rate that the giving and the household costs and the cumulative effect of annual deficits produced. And the relationship between those two rates was invisible to the women who were determining one of them, because the framework for seeing the relationship had never been given to them. The silence that surrounded the estate's condition, in the years between the husband's death and the estate's final accounting, was not a simple silence. It was a layered thing, with different weights and different textures at different levels, maintained by different people for different reasons that were, in each case, individually understandable, and that combined to produce an outcome that was worse for everyone than the alternative would have been. At the parents' level, the silence was maintained by the combination of pride and denial, and the specific difficulty of facing one's children with an admission that required revising the family story. The family story in these households had always included the fortune as a given, a permanent feature of the landscape, as present and as unquestionable as the house, or the portraits, or the silver. To tell the children that the fortune was smaller than it had been was to change the story. To tell them that it was significantly smaller, that the management of the past 10 or 15 years had produced a result quite different from what the husband had intended, was to tell them not just a different story, but a story in which the teller had played a role that she did not want to claim. Most women could not do this. Most women could not bring themselves to initiate the conversation that would require them to say, to their children, "The inheritance you're expecting is not what you will receive. I have managed it in ways that have produced a different result. Here is what the result is. Here is what I did, and here is what it cost you." That conversation required an acceptance of responsibility that was very difficult to frame, because the responsibility was genuine, but the incompetence that produced the situation was itself the product of a failure that was not the widow's fault, a failure of the system that had formed her. She could not easily say, "I managed it badly," and yet also say, "I managed it with what I was given, and what I was given was insufficient, and the insufficiency was not my doing." Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the combination was a kind of moral complexity that was very difficult to hold in a single conversation with one's children, particularly for women who had spent their lives in a world that rewarded simplicity and composure and the presentation of a clear, untroubled surface. So they did not hold it in a conversation. They held it privately, in the specific private space where they managed the distance between what the situation actually was and what they were able to present it as being. They held it for years, in some cases for a decade or more, and they maintained the surface as long as maintaining the surface was possible, and they said things were fine when asked, and they believed it in the approximate way that people believe things they need to believe, and the children saw the surface and believed it too, because the children also needed to believe it, and because the surface was maintained well enough for long enough that believing it was the more comfortable option, and the one that the structure of family life most fully supported. The children's silence was maintained by love and by the social conventions of the relationship, which were powerful. Pressing a parent for specific financial information was not something that the conventions of the era accommodated easily. It implied oversight. It implied a challenge to parental authority and parental competence. It implied a suspicion that was, in the absence of specific dramatic evidence, difficult to justify to oneself as necessary. The children noticed the small things and explained them away, because explaining them away was what love does with ambiguous evidence, and what convention does with discomfort, and what the desire for the story to remain unchanged does with the signs that the story is changing. The banker's silence was maintained by professional constraint and by the specific difficulty of saying things that clients did not want to hear. The banker could advise. The banker could present the numbers. The banker could express concern in language that was as direct as professional relationship allowed, which was not always very direct. But the banker could not compel. The bank managed the accounts that the widow brought to it, and provided the services the widow requested, and offered the counsel that the relationship permitted, and then stood aside while the widow made the decisions that were hers to make. All of this silence, the widow's silence toward her children, the children's silence toward their mother, the professional's constrained communication, combined to produce the specific outcome that the estate attorney's accounting eventually had to deliver, the outcome that the children had not been prepared for. That arrived in the lawyer's office as a number, precise and unambiguous, that required revision of every expectation that the silence had sustained. The revisions were made. People make revisions. They're capable of absorbing difficult information and adjusting their understanding and continuing forward with the adjusted understanding, and the children of these families did this as adult people do. But the revisions arrived later than they should have, when the information they contained was no longer actionable, when the window for changing the outcome had closed, when what remained was the understanding without the possibility of using the understanding to produce a different result. The lawyers who conducted the final accounting saw this over and over in their offices. They sat with the children who had not been told, who were absorbing the information now, too late. They provided the professional composure that these moments required, and they said the things that the moment called for, and they managed the process of settlement with the efficiency and the humanity that good professionals bring to difficult moments. And then the families left, and the files were organized, and the next appointment arrived, and the pattern continued in its reliable way across the decades of the practice. The men who built the great fortunes of the Gilded Age understood something about money that they never fully articulated to the people who would eventually inherit what they had built, partly because articulating it would have required the kind of explicit teaching that felt, to many of them, unnecessarily formal. They had not been taught explicitly. They had learned through doing, and they assumed, with the optimism of people who have succeeded at something, that the doing would teach their successors as it had taught them. But the doing teaches only the people who are allowed to do. The widows who inherited the fortunes had not been allowed to do the financial work, and so the financial work had not taught them, and the teaching that would have substituted for the doing had not happened because the men who could have provided it had not seen the necessity. They had made legal provisions. They had appointed advisors. They had structured the trusts and written the instructions and done, in the formal sense, what could be done to protect the estate from mismanagement. They had not sat down with the person who would inherit and said, "Here is how this works. Here is what principal is. Here is what income is. Here is what happens to income when principal declines. Here is what happens to the family when income declines past a certain point. Here is what you will need to know when I'm gone." And the lawyers have finished reading the will and the advisors have explained their roles, and you are alone in the house with the full responsibility of everything I have built. They had not done this because they did not expect to need to do it. They expected the structure to hold. They expected the advisors to advise effectively, and the widow to follow effective advice. They did not fully account for the possibility that advice, however effective in its formulation, is not effective in its application unless the person receiving it has the framework to evaluate it accurately. The framework is not given. It is built. It is built through engagement, through the specific experience of confronting real financial situations with real consequences and learning from those confrontations what works and what does not. The widows who managed their estates best were the ones who had in some form this experience before they needed it. The ones who managed worst were the ones who arrived at the inheritance without it, who received the advice and the quarterly statements and the meetings with the banker, and who processed all of this through a framework that was not adequate to what the processing required. This is the architectural failure at the centre of these stories. Not a failure of the individual women, not a failure of the individual men who built what they built and left what they left, but a failure of the system that formed them both, the system that designated certain knowledge as belonging to men and other knowledge as belonging to women, and that enforced the designation with the consistency that social systems enforce the things they care about, which is to say, thoroughly and over time, and with the specific mechanisms of reward and shame and exclusion that make social systems effective at the things they are effective at. The women in these stories were not the victims of their husbands' intentions. They were the products of a social system that had decided, long before they were born, how they would be educated and what they would know and what they would not. They managed the inheritances they received with the tools the social system had given them. The social system had not given them the tools they needed. The consequences were the consequences. In the houses on the avenues, in the rooms where the light fell with the same warmth across the decades of the widowhood, the consequences accumulated. They accumulated in the quarterly statements that were reviewed without full comprehension, in the decisions that were made without adequate framework, in the spending that exceeded the income in amounts that were invisible in the short term and significant in the long. They accumulated in the comfortable belief that things were fine, sustained by the social surface that the fortune made possible long after the fortune itself had begun to diminish, and in the letters that said nothing about what the letters did not say, and in the meetings that were held without producing the understanding they were meant to produce. The houses knew what was happening. Houses hold the history of what takes place inside them in the specific way of inanimate objects that have no investment in what they contain, faithfully, without judgment, in the condition of their carpets and their silver, and the quality of attention their maintenance receives. The houses told the story, to anyone who was looking at the right things, across the years of the widowhood. The story was there. The reading of it required tools that too few of the people who needed to read it had. There is a particular experience that comes from looking at a financial document, a balance sheet, an income statement, a quarterly estate accounting, when you have spent years building the understanding that such a document requires. The experience is one of immediate orientation. You know, within the first few seconds of reading, where you are and what the document is telling you, and what the next question is. The numbers have meaning before you have consciously processed them, the way a native speaker processes the grammar of a sentence before they have consciously parsed it. This experience is the product of years of practice. It cannot be replicated by a single explanation, however clear, or a single meeting, however thorough, or a series of quarterly reviews, however regularly attended. It is built through the repeated, sustained engagement with real financial situations that creates, over time, an internalized understanding that is different in kind from the understood in explanation knowledge that even a very clear explanation can produce. The women who inherited the Gilded Age fortunes did not have this experience. They arrived at the inheritance with the understood in explanation knowledge, the understanding that came from the explanations the lawyer and the banker provided, which was real understanding as far as it went, but that went only as far as the explanation itself. Beyond the explanation was the territory that the explanation could not reach, the intuitive grasp of proportion, of rate, of the significance of small differences compounded across time, of the way that a number that looks stable is not necessarily stable in the financial sense that matters for the long-term management of an estate. What they needed was not more or better explanations. They needed the years of practice that would have made the explanations unnecessary. They needed to have been in the room across the decades of the marriage, reviewing the accounts as the husband reviewed them, asking the questions the husband asked, developing through that participation the specific financial intuition that sustained engagement produces. They needed, in short, the formation that had been consistently denied them, substituted with an explanation provided after the fact, after the inheritance had arrived, and the formation it required was already past the point at which it could have been given. The explanation could help, and sometimes it did. The women who were most attentive in the quarterly meetings, who pressed for the most specific answers, who did not accept the general reassurance but pursued the specific question, those women sometimes built, through the engagement with the explanations, something that functioned approximately like the intuition they had not been given. It was slower work than the original formation would have been, and it was done against the pressure of an ongoing management responsibility rather than in the preparation for a future one. But it was possible, and the women who pursued it with enough consistency sometimes managed to build enough of what they needed to make a material difference in the outcomes their estates produced. Most did not pursue it with that consistency. Most engaged with the quarterly meetings at the level of the meetings themselves, present, attentive, asking the questions that came naturally to the level of understanding they had, accepting the answers without pursuing them further. Most left the meetings with the feeling of having discharged the responsibility of engagement, without having built the understanding that genuine engagement requires. The feeling was comfortable. It was not, in the specific financial sense that mattered for the estate, adequate. The women who managed best were often distinguished from the women who managed worst not by intelligence. There was no reliable intelligence differential between the two groups, but by a quality of intellectual discomfort. The discomfort of knowing that they did not fully understand something they were responsible for. The discomfort that drives the additional question, the returned to topic, the persistent inquiry that does not accept the explanation at face value, but pursues the meaning behind the explanation. This was the quality that, when present, produced the better outcomes. It was not a quality that the social conventions of these women's world encouraged. Certainty was more comfortable than uncertainty. The managed surface was more comfortable than the acknowledged gap. The convention that the banker knew best was more comfortable than the inquiry that challenged his assessment. The women who maintained the discomfort, who would not let themselves settle into the comfortable certainty that things were being managed appropriately, were the women who built something useful from the limited opportunities the situation provided. They were the ones who went back after the meeting and asked the follow-up question, who requested additional information between the scheduled reviews, who said, when an explanation was not fully clear, that they needed it explained differently, and who persisted in that request until they found an explanation that was clear, who made the financial management of the estate an ongoing engagement rather than a periodic obligation. These women existed. They were the exceptions. The exceptions matter because they show what was possible, and what was possible shows what was generally not happening, and what was generally not happening shows where the system was failing. The legal frameworks governing marriage in the Gilded Age were not neutral instruments that happened to produce outcomes favourable to men. They were designed, across the common law tradition from which they emerged, to produce exactly the outcomes they produced. The transfer of women's property to husbands upon marriage, the dissolution of the wife's separate legal identity into the husband's, the effective ownership by the husband of everything the wife brought to or earned during the marriage. These were not bugs in the system, they were features. They expressed the social understanding of the era about the proper relationship between husbands and wives, between men and money, between female capacity and male authority. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed state by state across the middle and later decades of the 19th century, modified these frameworks in significant ways, allowing women to own property in their own names, to make contracts, to keep their own earnings. But the modifications were implemented in an era in which the social conventions surrounding money still operated in the old way, even after the legal conventions had changed, and social conventions are slower to change than legal ones because they are maintained by softer mechanisms, by the expectations of communities, by the norms of households, by the specific quality of discomfort that attaches to behaviour that departs from the expected, and these mechanisms do not respond to legislative action the way that legal frameworks do. The result was that the legal capacity to own property independently was available to the women of the Gilded Age long before the social capacity to exercise that ownership was fully developed. The legal right to ask about the accounts existed in principle. The social permission to ask about the accounts, in a household organised around a husband who managed the financial life and a wife who managed the domestic one, was a different thing. Women who asserted the legal right to engage with the financial management of their households encountered in most cases the specific mild resistance of a social convention that did not accommodate the assertion comfortably. The husband who was asked too precisely about the quarterly returns might provide the information because the legal framework gave the wife the right to it, while simultaneously conveying, in manner and in tone and in the specific quality of attention he brought to her questions, that the questions were somewhat outside the expected range of her interests, and that the interest itself was slightly irregular. This was not outright refusal. The law had changed, and the outright refusal was no longer available. But the social resistance was real, and it was sufficient in most cases to discourage the kind of sustained, consistent engagement that the building of genuine financial understanding requires. The second marriage complicated this in a specific way. The widow who entered a second marriage after years of attempting, with varying success, to manage a large estate independently, was a woman whose financial experience was real, but whose confidence in that experience might be quite limited, precisely because the years of management had consisted of doing something she had not been adequately prepared for, and the doing of something for which one is not adequately prepared does not produce the confidence that adequate preparation would have generated. It produces a more complicated thing. The knowledge that you have been managing, and the unease about how well you have been managing, and the specific vulnerability of someone who is aware of the gap between what the responsibility requires and what they bring to it. Into this vulnerability came the second husband, who had or appeared to have what she lacked: confidence, financial fluency, the manner of someone who had been managing money successfully for a long time and who knew how money worked in the specific way that she did not. This was not a fiction, necessarily. Some second husbands did have genuine financial competence, and the marriages to those men produced genuinely better outcomes for the estates they managed. But in the cases that ended badly, the confidence and the fluency in the manner were present without the underlying substance that would have justified them, and the widow, without the tools to distinguish the genuine from the performed, chose on the basis of what she could see. She could see what he showed her. She could not see what the convention of financial investigation prevented her from examining, and in the space between what she could see and what she could not examine, the situation that would take years to fully manifest was already, in the first days of the second marriage, in the process of becoming. The relationship between charity and inheritance in these stories is not simply a story of competing goods, the good of the institutional beneficiaries set against the good of the children who inherited less. It is also a story about the specific moral psychology of the women who gave, the particular way that the giving felt to them and what the feeling meant for the decisions they made. For Eleanor Whitmore and for women like her, the giving was not experienced as a choice between two things of equal weight. The estate's preservation on one side, the institution's need on the other. It was experienced as a choice between a concrete, specific present need and an abstract general future concern. The furnace at the settlement house was concrete. The children who would be cold without the furnace were specific, people she knew, people she visited. The abstract, the estate's long-term health, the children's eventual inheritance, was real. But it was real in the way that things are real when you have not been given the tools to make them feel real. The concreteness of the immediate need always won, in Eleanor's moral experience, against the abstraction of the long-term consequence. Not because Eleanor was incapable of abstract moral reasoning. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable moral seriousness and thoughtfulness. But because the specific quality of the abstraction, the quarterly statement, principal and income rate of diminishment abstraction, was an abstraction that required a financial framework to convert into something that could compete with the concrete, and that framework was the framework she had not been given. If she had had it, if the language of principal and income and the long-term consequences of annual deficits had been as familiar and as accessible to her as the language of need and response and the specific warmth of a furnace that would keep her family from freezing, the balance of the decision would have been different. Not necessarily different in outcome. Real need is real need, and real care for real people is a value that does not yield easily to any abstraction, however well framed. but different in character, different in the quality of engagement with the full scope of the choice. She would have known specifically what she was choosing. Not approximately, not in the general way of understanding that something comes at some cost, but specifically. She would have known that this $25,000 donation for the settlement house furnace was a withdrawal from a principal of approximately this size, which generated income of approximately this amount, and that the withdrawal reduced the principal by this proportion, which would reduce next year's income by this amount, and that next year's reduction would, at the current rate of spending, require a corresponding increase in the draw on principal, and so on across the years ahead. She would have known, and knowing, she might have given differently. Not less necessarily. She might have given exactly as much, having decided that the full knowledge of the consequence was an appropriate price for the giving. But she would have decided with the full information in her possession. And the decision made with full information, even if it produces the same outcome as the decision made without it, is a different kind of decision, one that the decision-maker can stand behind in the fullest sense, because the standing is chosen rather than produced by the absence of the knowledge that would have allowed a different choice. This is the educational failure's deepest dimension. It was not simply that it produced worse financial outcomes, though it did produce worse financial outcomes. It was that it prevented the women who inhabited these situations from making the decisions they would have made if they had been fully equipped to make them. It stole from them not just the financial knowledge, but the moral autonomy that genuine knowledge enables. The autonomy of making choices with full information, of deciding with full awareness of what one is deciding, of being genuinely responsible for one's choices because one genuinely understood them. Eleanor gave as she gave. We cannot know what she would have chosen if the framework had been present. We know what she chose without it, and we know that the difference between what she chose and what a different choice might have produced was the difference that the estate documents record. The distance between 2,100,000 and 240,000, measured across 23 years in the currency of annual deficits and diminishing principal. The children who were not told grew up inside a performance. The performance was not conscious deception in most cases. It was the maintenance of a surface that the parents themselves, in their daily experience of their own lives, mostly believed in. The surface was the surface of the life they lived, which was the life of a prosperous family, conducted in a prosperous house, with the servants and the social obligations and the seasonal patterns of a family of position. The surface was real in the sense that it was the actual texture of daily life. It was not real in the sense that the financial foundation supporting it was not what it had been and was continuing to decline. The children inhabited the surface the way everyone inhabits the daily texture of their lives, with the specific inattention of the familiar. Things that have always been a certain way are not things you look at carefully. You live in them, as you live in the rooms of a house you have always known. The house is the house. The rooms are the rooms. The carpets are beginning to thin at the edges, but carpets always thin at the edges. And this is not a thing you notice clearly because this is the carpet as you have always known it. And the carpet as you have always known it is simply what a carpet looks like. The children noticed the thinning, but not as thinning specifically, as a quality of the carpet that they had always known, that had always been a little thinner in that corner than in the centre. That was simply what the corner of that carpet looked like and had always looked like. The house's character included its worn edges, and the worn edges were not alarms. They were just edges, just the specific texture of the specific life inside the specific house. This was how the performance worked, not as something that required active maintenance beyond what the ordinary management of a household required. The performance maintained itself, because the thing being performed was the continuation of what had always been, and the continuation of what has always been is not experienced as performance by anyone who has always known it. The children who eventually discovered the estate's actual condition, in the accountings of estate attorneys, in the specific precision of the numbers that the attorneys provided, in the revision of the family story that the numbers required. Those children experienced the discovery as a rupture in the surface, a sudden visibility of what had been invisible. Not because the surface had been opaque. Some of the signs had been visible, and some of the children had noticed some of them, but because the full significance of the signs had not been visible until the numbers were laid out in the full precision of a legal accounting. The rupture was, in most cases, manageable. Adults manage ruptures. They revise their understanding of the past and they adjust their expectations for the future, and they live in the adjusted understanding with the resilience that people have when they must. But the rupture left marks. It left the specific mark of having learned something at the wrong time, not before it could have been prevented, but after the prevention was no longer possible. Not as preparation, but as accounting. Not as the beginning of a story with an open ending, but as the explanation of a story that had already concluded. The mark was not bitterness in most cases. It was something quieter. The specific quiet of adults who have understood something about their past that they would rather not have understood, who have revised the story they told about their family and their childhood and the life they were raised to expect, and who carry the revision as the particular weight of knowledge that arrives too late to be useful in the ways you most needed it to be useful. They carried it forward. They told their children things, some of them. They described what they had understood and when they had understood it, and what they wished they had understood earlier. The telling was the specific gift they had to offer, the thing the experience had produced that had value for the people who came after. The understanding of what happens when certain kinds of knowledge are absent from the people who most need them, and what it costs and what the cost cannot buy back. The question of what a collection is worth, as distinct from what individual works within it are worth, is a question that the financial framework of estate settlement does not fully accommodate. The collection, as a curated thing, assembled by a specific intelligence, expressing a specific aesthetic understanding, representing a sustained engagement with a particular moment in the history of making, has a value that is greater than the sum of its individual components, in the same way that a sentence has a value that is greater than the sum of its individual words. The words can be rearranged, used in other sentences, evaluated individually for their quality and their meaning. The sentence, dismantled into words, is no longer the sentence. Harriet's collection, assessed as a collection, was the expression of an intelligence that had been, across 25 years, consistently right. The works she had chosen were the works that had proved, in the market's gradual recognition, to be exactly what her eye had told her they were. The Cézanne she had bought in 1899 for $38,000 was, by 1920, worth considerably more. The other works had appreciated at varying rates, but the pattern of the collection's appreciation was the pattern of a selector who had bought well, who had understood the significance of what she was selecting before the market consensus had formed around it. This intelligence could not be inherited along with the works. The children who received the estate did not have Harriet's eye, or had it to different degrees and in different applications, and the collection as a curatorial argument for the consistency of that eye was an argument that required Harriet's presence to make. Without her, the collection was not an argument. It was a group of works, each with its own specific value and its own specific condition, and its own specific place in the market for such work. And the group could be dispersed without losing the individual works, but entirely losing the thing that had given the collection its character. They dispersed it. They had to. The financial situation required it. And in the dispersing, the collection became what all dispersed collections become: a historical fact, a provenance entry in the records of the works that had passed through it, a few lines in the auction house catalogue noting the fellow's collection as the source of origin. The intelligence that assembled the collection, and the sustained engagement with art that produced the intelligence, those things dispersed with the collection, becoming past tense, part of the historical record of a particular woman's particular engagement with a particular moment in the history of painting. What remained after the dispersal was the impact. The impact was not auditable in the financial sense, but it was real. The people who encountered the works in their new locations, in their new institutional settings, or their new private collections, encountered works that had been selected by an eye that knew what it was looking at. The pleasure those works gave, and continue to give, to everyone who encounters them is a real thing. It is not in the estate documents. It is in the rooms where the paintings hang and in the specific experience of the people who stand in front of them and look. Additional depth, Act 7. The mother who could not say no to the son was, in the specific way of these stories, unable to say it not because the no was unavailable to her in principle, but because saying it would have required converting the abstract into the concrete in a direction she could not manage. The abstract, the estate's long-term condition, the other children's inheritance, the trajectory that continued provision was producing, was available to her in principle. It appeared in the quarterly statements, in the banker's measured concern, in the conversations with Margaret that she deflected and moved past. She knew the abstraction was there. What she could not do was convert it into the specific present tense reality that competing with the son's need required. The son's need was present tense. It was here, in this room, in the person she had loved since before he was born, in the face that was her husband's face and her face both, in the voice that asked for what it needed in the specific way of an adult person who has always known that asking would be answered. The need was concrete in the way that love is concrete, felt, immediate, located in a specific person whom she could see and touch, and whose relief at her yes she could observe in the specific direct way of someone present at the exchange. The estate's trajectory was not present tense in the same way. It was a set of projections, lines on a chart that extended into a future that had not happened yet, toward outcomes that were real in the financial sense, but that were not located in a person she could see, not felt in the immediate way of present experience. She could understand them intellectually. She could not feel them with the same immediate force that she felt the son's need. And in the competition between what she could feel and what she could understand, the feeling won. This is not a failure of reason. It is a very human response to a situation in which two things of different levels of accessibility, the immediate and concrete versus the abstract and projected, are in competition. Most people would have difficulty in the same situation, at least in the early iterations of the competition, before the pattern had accumulated into something that could itself be felt rather than only understood. The widow who had been given the financial framework, who had internalized the understanding of principal and income over years of active engagement with the estate's management, might have felt the trajectory as concretely as she felt the need. The framework might have done what the framework does when it is deeply understood, made the abstract feel real, given the projected consequences the same present tense weight that immediate needs carry. She had not been given that framework. She felt what she could feel. She acted on what she felt. The estate declined in the way that estates decline when the abstract cannot compete with the concrete, and the declining was the evidence of the absence, and the absence was the product of the convention, and the convention is the thing that needs to be understood if these stories are to be understood as the structural stories they are rather than the individual stories of individual failings that the surface suggests. The apartments that received the women who had sold the houses were, in most documented cases, located on streets near the ones the houses had occupied. Park Avenue or Riverside Drive rather than Fifth Avenue. The same general territory, the same general social world, but a different expression of it. The women who moved to them maintained their connections. They continued to be invited to the kinds of gatherings they had always attended. They continued, in the compressed form available to a woman managing an apartment and a reduced budget, the social life that had always been a central part of their existence. The continuity was real, and it mattered. The social life had not diminished entirely. The relationships had not ended. The position, modified, survived. There was a version of the life available in the smaller space, and the women who inhabited it did not disappear from their world. They remained in it at a different scale, with a different financial foundation, but present and engaged, and still the people they had always been in most of the ways that mattered to the people who knew them. What had changed was the interiority of the thing. The relationship these women had with themselves, the story they told themselves about who they were and what they were doing in the world, that had changed in the specific way that things change when you discover you're living a different story from the one you believed you were living. The social world accommodated the apartment. The internal world required a reckoning that the social world could not provide, and that each woman undertook privately in the afternoons when there was no one visiting, and the light was doing its late-day work on whatever surfaces the apartment contained. The reckoning was not always dramatic. It was usually quiet, a kind of stock-taking done over months and years of how the situation had come to be what it was and what it meant for the remaining years. A gradual revision of the understanding of the past, of the years of the widowhood, of the choices made in those years, of the relationship between those choices and the present situation. A private, honest accounting that arrived, in most cases, at something more like understanding than blame, because the women who went through it were women of sufficient intelligence to see the structural dimensions of the situation, even when the social conventions of their world did not give them the vocabulary to articulate those dimensions publicly. They understood, without necessarily being able to say so in the terms that a structural analysis would require, that they had been formed for something other than what had been required of them, that the situation had required tools they had not been given, that the absence of the tools was not, at the deepest level, their doing, and that the absence had consequences that were real, regardless of the level at which the responsibility for the absence was located. This understanding did not undo what had been done, but it shaped how they lived with what had been done, not with the bitterness of someone who has been wronged, which would have required a simpler understanding, but with the more complicated feeling of someone who has understood something too late, who sees clearly where the difficulty originated and how it operated and what it produced, and who cannot change any of it, but who can carry the understanding forward and offer it, in whatever forms are available, to the people who might benefit from receiving it before it is too late to use. The professional world that surrounded these estates, the bankers, the lawyers, the estate attorneys, operated within constraints that were simultaneously professional and social, and the social constraints were sometimes harder to overcome than the professional ones. The professional constraints were explicit: confidentiality obligations, the limits of the advisory role, the client's right to make her own decisions. These were understood and respected by the professionals who operated within them. The social constraints were less explicit but equally operative. They were the constraints of a world that maintained certain expectations about how conversations between professionals and wealthy women should be conducted, with what degree of directness, at what level of specificity, with what assumption about the woman's capacity to absorb and act on difficult information. These expectations were, in the specific historical context of the Gilded Age, shaped by the same convention that had shaped everything else: the assumption that women's relationship to money was essentially passive, that they managed in the domestic sense but not in the financial one, and that the professional who treated them as genuinely capable of financial understanding was not simply being helpful, but was potentially challenging an assumption that the entire social structure rested on. This constraint was felt, even by professionals who did not consciously endorse the assumption behind it, as a kind of pressure on the manner of the conversation, toward indirectness, toward gentleness, toward the softening of difficult information in ways that made the information more comfortable and less actionable. The professionals who resisted this pressure, who said directly what the estate's condition was and what the trajectory implied and what change was required, were professionals who were acting against the social grain of their moment, and the action had a cost. Clients who were told difficult things too directly sometimes responded with discomfort that expressed itself as reduced confidence in the advisor, which expressed itself as a change of advisor. The professionals who remained in their roles across the years of a widowhood, who stayed as the estate's condition changed and the quarterly meetings continued, and the conversation maintained its form, were professionals who had calibrated their directness to what the relationship would sustain. The calibration was, in retrospect, too often insufficient, too indirect, too gentle, too willing to accept the widow's acknowledgement of the concern as equivalent to the adjustment the concern required. But the calibration was not arbitrary. It was the product of the specific pressures that the professional relationship operated under, pressures that were structural and that individual professionals could modify at the margins but not eliminate entirely. What the system needed, and what the individual professional relationship could never be the vehicle for, was a different formation of the woman who arrived at the inheritance. A formation that began before the inheritance, and that built, over the years of the marriage and the years of the widowhood's approach, the understanding that the quarterly meeting and the estate accounting assumed. This formation was not available within the professional relationship, which begins after the inheritance has arrived, and the woman is already managing rather than preparing. The formation that would have mattered had to happen before the managing, in the years of the marriage, in the education that preceded the marriage, in the social structure that determined what women learned and what they were permitted to know. The lawyers and the bankers and the estate attorneys who managed these situations knew this. They knew it in the professional way, not always explicitly articulated, not always converted into the advocacy for systemic change that the knowledge warranted, but known in the practical sense of people who have seen enough cases to understand the pattern they are seeing. Davies articulated it. Others felt it without articulating it. The knowledge was present, in the files and the memories and the private reflections of the professionals who had worked with these estates across the decades of their practice. The knowledge did not immediately change the system, it accumulated. It contributed, alongside other forces and other pressures, to the gradual change that the system underwent across the decades of the early 20th century. The educational reforms, the legal changes, the economic shifts that gave women access to and participation in the financial life of their households, and their era in ways that the convention of the closed door had denied them. The change was incomplete, as changes always are. The closed doors that had been opened in some households were still shut in others. The education that was available in some contexts was not available in all. The progress was real, And the progress was partial, and the progress is, in some dimensions, still ongoing. The light continues to fall through windows that were built in one era and that have survived into another. It falls on the rooms of houses that have changed their uses, that are museums, or hotels, or apartments, or offices, or simply rooms in houses that have passed through many owners and many changes and that retain, in their walls and their proportions and the quality of the light that comes through their specific windows at specific times of day, something of what they were built to contain. The light doesn't know the difference between what was and what is. It simply illuminates what is in front of it, with the patient warmth of light in the late afternoon, when the day is preparing to close and the rooms are at their warmest and most still. In those rooms, in that light, the stories of the women who managed the great estates, and the women who diminished them, and the women who learned from the diminishment, and the women who are still learning, all of those stories are present, in the way that rooms contain the history of what has happened in them, available to anyone who knows how to look. The looking requires the specific tools that any reading requires: patience, attention, the willingness to follow a thread through the long logic of its unfolding, the capacity to hold complexity without resolving it prematurely into a cleaner story than the evidence supports. The stories are there, patient and specific and more complicated than the financial accounts that record them suggest. The accounts say what happened to the money. The stories say what happened to the people, and what happened between the people, and what happened in the space between the people and the money that was supposed to connect them, but that, for reasons that were structural before they were individual, connected them imperfectly, at great cost, in ways that left the mark of the cost on the generations that followed without fully understanding why the cost had been paid. The understanding is available now, partially, imperfectly, with all the limitations that any historical understanding carries, but available. In the archives, in the files, in the private memoirs of professionals who watched, and the letters of daughters who observed, and the estate accountings that record the specific arithmetic of what occurred, available to anyone who's willing to sit with it long enough to follow the thread through the long logic of its unfolding. Sit with it. Let the light fall. Let the story tell itself in the patient way of things that have all the time in the world. There is a kind of spending that does not feel like spending. It feels like building. It feels like the careful and deliberate accumulation of objects that carry, by their nature and their history, and the specific gravity of things made by human skill at its most refined, a value that exceeds the price paid for them at the moment of purchase. When you stand in a room where a great painting hangs, where the light falls across the surface in the way the painter accounted for, where the colours have the quality of things that have been seen and thought about and rendered rather than simply applied, there is something in that room that cannot be reduced to the transaction that brought the painting there. There is a presence in the room, a quality of attention the room rewards, that is real and that no account book captures. This feeling is not wrong. It corresponds to something true about what great art is and does. Objects of genuine quality, made by people of genuine talent, carry a value across time that is not purely financial and that cannot be calculated by any method that a banker would recognize. They give pleasure that accumulates, they educate the eye, they provide to every person who enters the room where they hang the specific experience of encountering something that matters, something that required the full attention of a serious person to make, and that repays, in the viewing, a portion of the attention it cost. But there is another truth about paintings, which is that they are not liquid. They are not divisible into thirds or quarters. They cannot be converted at the moment that conversion is required, at the price that the financial logic of an estate requires, because the moment of required conversion and the moment of optimal market conditions are not reliably the same moment, and an heir who needs to sell is not a collector who can wait, and the distance between those two positions is measurable in the price the work actually commands versus the price it would have commanded in different circumstances. The women who built great private art collections in the Gilded Age and its aftermath discovered this. Not at the time of purchase, when the purchase felt like building something permanent and valuable, but at the time of the estate's settlement, when the paintings that had hung in the rooms for 25 years were found to be worth, in the market conditions of that particular moment, something less than the sum that had been spent to acquire them across those 25 years, and something that could be realized only by selling them in ways that broke the collection apart and sacrificed the coherence that had given it its character and much of its value. Harriet Fellows was the collector among the women in these stories who most thoroughly documented her process, Because she was a woman who took her collecting seriously in the professional sense, and who maintained detailed records of the acquisitions, the prices paid, the dealers consulted, the assessments of the work's condition and provenance and art historical significance. These records survive in a family archive and allow a reconstruction of the collection's growth and eventual dispersal that is unusually precise. She had been left, when her husband Edward died in 1893, an estate of approximately $2,200,000, the product of 30 years in the wool and textile trade. The estate was structured to provide income and to preserve principal. The income in 1893 was approximately $100,000 per year, sufficient for the Commonwealth Avenue house and the summer cottage in Manchester by the Sea, and the social life that a woman of Harriet's position was expected to maintain, with something remaining. She had always had an eye for painting. During Edward's lifetime, the collection they kept was modest. Pleasant landscapes, a portrait or two, decorative objects that filled the house with appropriate beauty, without making claims to significance. Edward had been indifferent to art in the aesthetic sense, though he appreciated its social function, and the collecting had operated within limits set by his indifference and by the household budget, which allocated enough for pleasantness but not for seriousness. When Edward died and the money was hers, the limits lifted. On her second trip to Paris in 1895, she encountered in the galleries and dealers' rooms of the city a body of work that she found in the specific pre-rational way that the eye finds things before the mind formulates the judgment, genuinely extraordinary. The painters who were being argued about in those years, whose place in the tradition was contested, whose prices reflected the uncertainty of their reception by the consensus that had not yet formed around them, she looked at those works and understood, with whatever quality of visual intelligence allows some people to make that judgment before the consensus catches up that she was looking at the real thing. She bought. Not impulsively. She was not an impulsive woman in any domain. She looked carefully and she returned and she looked again, and she obtained opinions she trusted, and she negotiated as a person who knew the value of what she was acquiring and who was not going to overpay. But she bought with a conviction that the purchases were right, and the conviction was, in most cases, correct. The work she selected across the years of her collecting proved to be, by the assessment of everyone who examined the collection in its maturity, the selections of a genuine eye, not a dealer's eye or a social positioning eye, but the eye of someone who looked at paintings and understood what they were looking at. The collection grew across 12 years of active acquisition, from 1895 to 1907, after which the pace slowed without fully stopping. In those 12 years, she spent approximately $950,000 on art. The acquisitions included the Cézanne, purchased in 1899 from a Paris dealer for $38,000, which was at the time an exceptional price for a work by a painter who was admired by a small, serious community and not yet recognized by the consensus as the foundational figure he would become. It included 2 Renoirs, 3 Monet studies, a Degas drawing, 2 Pissarros, 2 Vuillard, a Bonnard, and a body of other work by painters of the generation that had changed what painting could be. $950,000. In a 12-year period in which the estate's income was approximately $100,000 per year, meaning that the income over that period was approximately $1,200,000, which meant that the art acquisitions alone, before the ordinary expenses of the household and the social life in the summer cottage, consumed something in the range of 80% of the estate's income during those years. The actual expenditure exceeded the income naturally, which is to say that the art spending combined with the household's ongoing costs required annual draws on the principal. The principal, reduced by those draws, generated less income. The reduced income required larger draws to sustain the same level of expenditure. This is the pattern that appears in every one of these stories, varied only in the specific mechanism of depletion. Harriet's eldest son James discovered the scope of the situation in 1906, in a conversation with the estate banker that James had sought out independently, presenting himself as a concerned family member who wanted to understand where things stood. The banker provided the accounting. The estate in 1906 was approximately $1,600,000, of which approximately $580,000 represented the estimated market value of the art collection. The liquid and income-generating assets were therefore approximately $1,020,000, generating income of perhaps $50,000 per year. Annual expenditure was running between $120,000 and $140,000. The annual deficit was being covered by drawing down the liquid assets. James did the calculation the banker had already done. The liquid assets, at the current rate of drawing, would be substantially depleted within 12 to 15 years. At that point, his mother would be in her mid to late 70s, and her only significant asset would be the collection. He went to see his mother that weekend. The conversation was careful and loving and not entirely successful. Harriet listened to everything he said with the attentiveness she brought to everything she valued, which included her son's concern even when she found it, at the level of response, insufficient motivation to change her practice. She agreed that the pace might need to slow. She noted that the Vuillard she'd seen in New York the previous month was of a quality that did not often appear at that price. She told him she would think very seriously about what he had raised. She bought the Vuillard. She bought it because it was, as she had said, of a quality that did not often appear at that price, and this was true, and the judgment behind the purchase was the same judgment that had assembled the rest of the collection, and the judgment was good. The Vuillard was a real thing. The purchase was, as an act of aesthetic decision-making, entirely correct. As an act of financial decision-making by a woman managing an estate of specific and finite resources on behalf of herself and her children, it was the continuation of a pattern that James had correctly identified as problematic, and that continued because the framework for stopping it, the moral imagination of the collection as a finite project rather than an ongoing one, was not available to Harriet in the same way the aesthetic judgment was. Harriet died in 1920. The collection numbered 47 works. The estate attorney had it appraised at approximately $850,000 in the market conditions of the post-war years, conditions that were not optimal for the sale of European Impressionist work. The liquid assets were approximately $200,000. James and his sisters Augusta and Eliza spent several weeks in the estate attorney's conference room working through the options. Donate the collection to a museum, receiving acknowledgement and a tax benefit but no cash. Sell the collection as a whole to an institution or a collector, if such a buyer could be found in the market conditions of 1920. Or sell the works individually, sacrificing the collection's coherence for the liquidity the situation required. They chose the individual sales. The process took 4 years. The Cézanne, which had been purchased for $38,000 in 1899, sold in 1922 for considerably more. The artist's reputation had settled in the intervening 23 years exactly as Harriet had anticipated. Other works sold well. Others sold at prices that were disappointing relative to what had been paid, and to what they would eventually be worth in the longer market. The aggregate proceeds, after dealer commissions and auction fees and the taxes generated by the sales, came to approximately $620,000 over 4 years, divided 3 ways. Each of the fellows' children received something in the range of $200,000, plus a third of the remaining liquid assets. It was, as estates go, not a disaster. It was, as the children privately measured it, against the $2,200,000 that Edward Fellows had left, a significant reduction. The distance between those two figures, the distance that represented 30 years of Harriet's management, was the collection and the household, and the specific way that a woman of genuine aesthetic intelligence managed an estate with tools adequate to the aesthetic decisions and insufficient for the financial ones. The collection is dispersed now. The Cézanne is in an institutional collection that does not note, on the label beside it, the complicated circumstances of its dispersal. The other works are in other rooms, in other collections, carrying in their provenance records the name Harriet Fellows as a former owner without the story that surrounds the ownership. They are beautiful. They are exactly what Harriet saw them to be. They have given pleasure, and will continue to give pleasure to everyone who encounters them. This is also true. All of it is true at once, and the truth of any one piece of it does not cancel the truth of the others. In almost every story of a Gilded Age fortune diminished in the hands of a wealthy widow, there is a son. Sometimes more than one son, but almost always at least one. A son whose relationship with his mother and with her money forms a thread through the years of the widowhood that, followed carefully through the account books and the correspondence, reveals itself as one of the consistent mechanisms of the estate's reduction. He was not, in almost any case, the villain of the story in the sense that word implies deliberate exploitation. He was, instead, something more ordinary and more human, a man who had grown up in the context of wealth, and had developed, as people who grow up in the context of wealth reliably develop, expectations of comfort and support that preceded and exceeded his own capacity to generate them. He had the expectations of a wealthy man before he had built anything that warranted such expectations, and the expectations were real even when the means to sustain them were not, and his mother was the person who stood, year after year, in the gap between the expectation and the reality, with the resources that partially closed it. The closings were always presented and usually believed to be temporary. The bridge loan, the emergency provision, the infusion that addressed a specific short-term crisis pending the recovery of a venture that was fundamentally sound. These were the terms in which the transactions were framed, and the framing was, at the moment of each transaction, genuine. He genuinely believed the venture was fundamentally sound. She genuinely believed the bridge was temporary. Both beliefs were sincere. Neither was, in the event, correct as often as the pattern required. Catherine Whitaker's relationship with her eldest son Thomas stands as one of the more thoroughly documented examples of this pattern. Because Catherine's personal correspondence was preserved in full, and Thomas's business records, in their incomplete form, have been examined by historians of Pennsylvania commerce who found in them evidence relevant to their own inquiries. Catherine had been left, when Thomas Sr. died in 1884, an estate of $1,600,000 and 3 children of various ages. Thomas Jr. was 22 at his father's death. He had his father's name and something of his father's manner, the directness that read as confidence, the social ease that made rooms comfortable for everyone in them, the quality of conviction in whatever he was currently thinking that made the people around him inclined to go along with it. These were real qualities. They were also qualities that, in the absence of the formation that his father had received through years of building something with them, were not quite sufficient for the sustained, patient, adversity-absorbing work of entrepreneurship. His father had been made by difficulty. The iron business had encountered difficulty in its early years and its middle years, and had periodically threatened, in the downturns of the 1860s and 1870s, to come apart entirely, and Thomas Sr. had held it together through those threats by means of sheer persistence and the willingness to revise his plans and absorb losses and continue working when continuing was the only option available. The difficulty had shaped him in ways that made him both durable and accurate in his assessments. He had been wrong enough times, at cost enough, that he had developed a healthy respect for the difference between what he hoped would happen and what the evidence suggested was likely to happen. Thomas Jr. had not had this formation. He had grown up in the house that the iron business built, which was a large and comfortable house, and the large and comfortable house had shaped him in the ways that large and comfortable houses shape the people who grow up in them, toward ease and expectation and the confidence that the world will accommodate itself to one's preferences, because in the world he had experienced, it largely had. The first venture, in coal distribution, was organised around relationships inherited from the iron business, a reasonable starting point, and the venture itself was not unreasonable in conception. It ran for 3 years, and then encountered the specific set of difficulties that the coal distribution business of the late 1880s was prone to encounter: pricing pressure from better capitalised competitors, fulfillment problems in a supply chain that depended on relationships that proved less stable than he had assumed, and a market that shifted faster than his capitalisation allowed him to respond to. He came to his mother in 1888 with a need. The need was real. There were specific debts that required addressing, specific obligations that were pressing. He presented the situation as temporary, as bridge needs always are, and the amount he required, $15,000, was in the context of an estate of $1.5 million, a sum that Catherine could provide without meaningful strain. She provided it. She provided it because he was her son, and the need was real, and the explanation was plausible, and providing it was the natural thing for a mother to do, which it was. The second venture, in Atlantic City real estate, lasted 4 years and produced over those 4 years 3 separate needs, each one a bridge, each one temporary. The total provided across the 4 years was approximately $65,000. The third venture, a manufacturing partnership in Trenton, lasted 4 years and produced 2 needs and a dissolution that required Catherine's most substantial single provision, $40,000 to cover the debt that the dissolution generated for a partner who had borrowed against his stake. Catherine gave. She gave each time in the same spirit she had given the first time, the spirit of a mother who loves her son and who sees a real need and who has the resources to address the real need, and for whom addressing it is the natural expression of what love does when it has the means to act. She gave without calculation, not because calculation was beyond her, but because the calculation that mattered, the calculation of the estate's long-term condition, of the cumulative effect of many provisions on the principal that generated the income that funded the giving, was a calculation she had not been given the tools to perform. Margaret, the second child, watched. She was a woman of sharp observation and considerable self-discipline, two qualities that her position in the family gave her ample opportunity to develop. She watched her brothers' ventures and their endings. She tracked, through the indirect evidence available to a daughter who was not shown the estate accounts, the pattern of provision. She formed a view of the estate's condition that was, by 1895, approximately correct in its assessment of the direction of travel, even if it lacked the precision of the actual figures. She said something once. In the spring of 1895, in the drawing room after Sunday lunch, she said to her mother that she was concerned. She said it as gently as she could, framing her concern as care for her mother rather than as criticism of the giving to Thomas. She said she had been noticing things and that she thought it would be worth understanding clearly what the estate's actual condition was. Her mother heard this as criticism, not of Thomas explicitly, but of her own management, her own choices, the expression of love through provision that had been the primary way she had related to her eldest son's difficulties for 7 years. The hearing was not unreasonable. It was a criticism, however gentle, of a pattern of behaviour that her mother had not been asked to examine, and did not want to examine. The response was warm and composed and deflective. She appreciated Margaret's concern. Things were being managed. The banker was competent. Everyone would be fine. Margaret did not raise it again. The single attempt had cost her something in the relationship, and had produced nothing useful in the situation, and the calculation of what a second attempt would cost versus what it might produce was not favourable. She made her own arrangements, quietly and separately, in the specific way of a daughter who has understood something she cannot change. Catherine died in 1903. The estate was approximately $600,000. After the costs of settlement and the final small provision to Thomas that the estate agreed to make, the 3 children divided approximately $540,000, $180,000 each. Thomas received his third and applied it to the next venture, which he described in a letter to his sister, with the characteristic enthusiasm and confidence that had characterized every venture before it. He was, he said, positioned for genuine success this time. The fundamentals were sound, the timing was right. He had learned, from the difficulties of the previous ventures, the specific things that would make the difference this time. Margaret put hers with her husband's investments and was comfortable. Robert, the youngest, had arranged himself independently enough that the inheritance supplemented rather than defined his position. The $600,000 that Thomas Sr. had left, that had been the foundation of what the children expected the estate to be, was gone. Not spent on frivolities or luxuries, spent on the household, on the charitable commitments, on the life that had always been lived at a certain level, and on a son who had needed things that his mother had been unable to deny him, because denying him would have required something she had not been given and could not locate in herself. The specific hard-edged ability to say that her love had a financial limit, and that the limit had been reached, and that the reaching was permanent. She had never found that ability. She had looked for it, on some level, in the way that people look for the thing they need and cannot find. She had not found it because the formation that would have allowed her to find it, the understanding of the estate's long-term condition, the framework for calculating what continued provision meant for the children who were not being provided for, was the formation that had never been given to her. She managed with what she had. What she had was love and good intention, and a blindness to the numbers that the convention of the closed door had guaranteed. The light fell the same way through her windows in the final years of her life as it had always fallen. She was, in those final years, a woman of somewhat reduced circumstances who lived in a house that was smaller than the one she'd started in, and who managed a household that had fewer staff and simpler arrangements than the one she'd grown up managing, and who was, by every account that has survived of those years, still warm and still capable of the quality of presence that had always characterized her, and still glad when her son visited, and still, when he visited, inclined to give him whatever he needed. She could not stop. It was not a choice she was capable of making. It would have required being a different person than she was, and you cannot ask a person who loves without limit to suddenly love within one. You can only, in retrospect, understand the cost. The house went last. This was the consistent pattern of these stories. across the range of families and circumstances and individual mechanisms of depletion that the historical record documents. Everything else was reduced before the house: the staff, the entertaining, the charitable budget, the summer houses, the carriages, eventually the horses themselves. But the main house, the primary residence that the fortune had built and that the family's identity was organised around, that house was the last thing to go. It was held on to long past the point at which a purely financial analysis would have recommended releasing it. It was held on to because releasing it was not a financial decision. It was an existential one. The house, in the world of the Gilded Age wealthy, was not simply a place to live. It was the material argument for a family's position in its world. It was the evidence, visible to anyone who stood on the sidewalk in front of it and looked at the facade, that the family was what the family said it was. It was the setting in which the social life of the family was conducted, and the social life was not, in this world, a peripheral matter. It was the primary medium through which position was maintained, through which the alliances and relationships that sustained a family's standing were cultivated and renewed. Without the house, the social life changed character fundamentally. Without the social life, the position changed character, and if the position changed, everything the family understood about itself required revision. To sell the house was to say, we are not the family that lives in a house like this. It was to say, the inheritance has diminished past the point at which we can maintain the life the inheritance was built to support. It was to say, what my husband built is no longer here in the form he built it. These were not comfortable things to say. They required a revision of the self that went deeper than finances, and that the women who eventually had to say them felt, almost universally, as a kind of loss that the financial terminology did not quite capture. Constance Beaumont had been maintaining the house on Fifth Avenue since her husband James's death in 1898. The house was 40 rooms on a limestone facade, with a ballroom that had hosted 200 guests in its best years, and a library that James had assembled across 30 years of prosperous commerce, and that remained, after his death, one of the finest rooms in the house. High-ceilinged, floor-to-ceiling shelving on 3 walls, the rolling ladders still in perfect working order, the books arranged by subject and within subject by date of acquisition in the systematic way that James had organised everything. James had left approximately $2,400,000. The house, in 1898, was a significant expense. The staff required to maintain 40 rooms numbered 17 when Constance reduced it from the 23 James had employed, and 17 was already something she thought of as economising. The social life that the house enabled and that Constance valued genuinely, and not merely instrumentally. The dinners, the smaller gatherings, the charitable events, the seasonal obligations, those generated costs that were real and that did not contract easily, because the obligations were real, and contracting real obligations required explanations that Constance was not prepared to offer. The estate's income was approximately $108,000 per year in the early years of the widowhood. Constance's expenditure was approximately $145,000 per year. The annual deficit of $37,000 was covered by drawing on the principal. The principal, reduced, generated less income. The following year's deficit was slightly larger. The process continued. Her banker Brewster raised the issue in annual meetings that were careful and direct and ultimately insufficient. He raised the specific question of the house in 1905, framing it not as a current necessity, but as a long-term consideration that deserved thought. He did not say the house should be sold. He said that the cost of maintaining the house relative to the estate's income was a fact that bore consideration. Constance considered it, and concluded that the house was not a cost that could be assessed purely in financial terms, which was true, but which was also a conclusion that insulated the central decision from the financial framework that was the only framework in which it could productively be examined. She maintained the house for 17 years after James's death. In those 17 years, the estate declined from $2,400,000 to something in the neighbourhood of $750,000, a reduction of about $1,650,000 through the combined effect of the annual deficits, the management costs, and the natural contraction of income as the principal was drawn down. The house itself, during those 17 years, aged in the way that large buildings age when they are maintained adequately but not lavishly. The facade was sound, the roof was intact, the heating was functional, but the elaboration of perfect maintenance, the kind of maintenance that 23 staff could provide, was no longer present. and the absence was visible to anyone who looked with attention. Her eldest daughter Louise came for lunch on a Sunday in November 1915 and looked with attention. She had been coming for Sunday lunch for 17 years, and she knew every room of the house in the particular way of a daughter who has grown up in a place, and what she saw on that particular Sunday was the accumulation of 17 years of small reductions, visible all at once as a pattern, rather than individually as explicable adjustments. She waited until they were in the drawing room with the afternoon light coming through the windows, and then she said what she'd come prepared to say. Constance listened to everything Louise said. She listened with the attention of a woman who had, on some level, been waiting for this conversation since approximately 1910, and who had used the waiting time to prepare herself for what it would contain. She did not argue with the financial picture Louise presented. She said, at one point, "Your father built this house." Louise said she knew. The statement and the response sat in the room together and were, in their simplicity, everything that needed to be said about the relationship between the house and the man who built it and the woman who inherited it and the years that had passed. Constance sold the Tuxedo Park house in 1916. This was the preliminary concession, the summer property, which had always been James's pleasure more than her own, and which she could construct a narrative around releasing that did not require the same degree of self-revision as the main house. The proceeds went into the estate and extended the horizon without resolving the fundamental situation. In 1917, a developer approached with an offer for the Fifth Avenue property and the lot. He was building a residential tower. He offered $380,000. Constance spent a week with the offer before accepting it, but the week was not a week of deliberation in the financial sense. The financial analysis was clear, the offer was adequate, the alternative was continuing to deplete the estate at the current rate, until the offer that eventually came would be less favourable. The week was a week of preparation, of understanding that she was about to become someone who had sold the house, of making room in her understanding of herself for the person she was going to be when the sale was complete. She moved to an apartment on Park Avenue, 12 rooms, high floor, entirely adequate. Her friends said it was lovely. They said she must be so relieved not to have all that house to manage. She agreed with them, because agreeing was easier than the truth, which was that the house had managed itself, in the specific sense that mattered, because she had never been given the framework to understand that it was not managing itself. The house had been there, and she had lived in it, and the money had funded the living, and the funding had reduced the money, and the reduction had eventually brought her to the apartment on Park Avenue, which was comfortable and adequate, and not the house. The Fifth Avenue house was demolished in 1917. The tower that replaced it was residential, 14 stories, 64 units, entirely functional. Architectural historians note the loss of the original building with the precision of their discipline. The limestone facade, the quality of the ornamental work, the ballroom's proportions. What they do not note, because it is not the subject of architectural history, is what the house contained across the 19 years of Constance's widowhood. The dinners, the conversations, the light through the tall windows, the life the fortune was built to make possible. Those things dispersed when the house was demolished. They exist now only in the memories of people who were there and in the private records that some of them kept. And those people are gone now, and the records are mostly gone, and the house is gone, and where it stood there is a building with 64 units, and a doorman and residents who have no particular knowledge of what was there before. Constance lived in the apartment on Park Avenue for 11 years, until 1928. She was careful with what she had, and she left her children something. The Hudson River School landscape that James had bought in 1872 came with her from the house, and hung above the apartment fireplace where the light caught it in the afternoon, in the same way it had always caught it, the same warmth, the same quality of attention to the natural world that the painter had brought to his subject more than 40 years before Constance was born. She looked at it in the afternoons when the light was right. It was the one thing that was exactly what it had always been. In the estate attorney's office, across the decades of the Gilded Age and the years that followed, knowledge accumulated that was unavailable anywhere else, and that could not, for reasons of professional ethics and client relationship, be shared in the ways that might have changed outcomes. It was the knowledge of how fortunes moved, from the first generation to the second to the third, and what happened at each passage to produce the distance between where the fortune began and where it arrived. Hartwell Davies practiced estate law in Philadelphia for 40 years, from the early 1880s to the mid-1920s. He kept a memoir unpublished in his lifetime that a granddaughter preserved and that historians have partially examined. It is not an indiscreet document. Davies was too professional for indiscretion. But it is candid in the way of private writing, and it contains, in the sections that address his female client specifically, an account of what he observed across 4 decades that is more direct than anything he could have said publicly. He observed, he wrote, a pattern so consistent that it stopped at some point in his middle career surprising him. Women of intelligence and capability arriving at estates they were entirely unprepared to manage. Managing those estates with the tools they had, which were considerable in most domains and almost absent in this one. Diminishing the estates through that management, not through intention or carelessness in any ordinary sense, but through the specific gap between what the management required and what their education had provided. He tried, from early in his career, to address this gap through the conversations he could have in his professional capacity. He called it, privately, the prudent woman conversation, the conversation he attempted to have with each new widow within the first 3 months of the estate's settlement. The conversation tried to establish, in language as clear and as direct as he could make it, without being condescending to women who were intelligent and who would be offended by condescension, the relationship between the estate's principal and the income it generated, and what that relationship meant for the question of how much could be spent annually without diminishing the principal. He had this conversation with women who listened carefully and who thanked him, and who left his office and who spent in the following year at a rate that demonstrated, when the next quarterly statement was prepared, that the conversation had not accomplished what he had hoped. He had it with women who argued with him, not unreasonably, since his argument required them to change behaviour that had always been considered appropriate, and to accept constraints that had never previously applied to them. He had it with women who absorbed it fully and managed their estates with a competence he genuinely admired, and that produced, when he reviewed those estates 20 years later, results that honoured what their husbands had built. The outcomes varied enormously, and the variable that determined them was not what he had initially expected it to be. He had expected it to be intelligence, that the more intelligent women would manage better, that the analytical capacity required to understand the prudent woman conversation would correlate with the capacity to sustain the behaviour the conversation recommended. He found, instead, that the relevant variable was prior engagement. Women who had had any engagement during their marriages with the financial management of the household in the capital sense, who had attended a quarterly meeting or reviewed an investment summary, or had a conversation with the banker that involved specific numbers and specific decisions rather than general assurances, those women were better equipped to manage what they inherited, not perfectly equipped, not immune to the same pressures and the same human pulls toward immediate provision over long-term preservation that affected every widow, but better equipped, in a measurable way, in the outcomes their estates produced. The prior engagement had been rare. The convention of the closed door had operated with consistency across the class in the era he served, and so he worked, in practice after practice, with women who arrived at the inheritance without the relevant preparation, and he tried to provide in the condensed form of a professional conversation what those women needed in the expanded form of years of participation, and he succeeded sometimes and fell short often, and the pattern continued. He described, in the section of his memoir most relevant to these stories, a woman he called Mrs. W., who was the most determined student of financial management he had encountered across 40 years of practice. She came to him monthly. She arrived with questions that grew more sophisticated over time. She read the quarterly statements with increasing comprehension and brought back to the monthly meetings specific questions about specific line items that revealed, in their specificity, a genuine effort to build the framework that the education had not provided. She was, he wrote, doing in her 60s what she should have been allowed to do in her 30s, building from the outside in and from questions forward an understanding of the estate's structure that the structure should have been explained to her before she was responsible for it. She was learning while she was managing, which meant that she was managing in the early years of her effort with an incomplete understanding, and the incompleteness had already produced results that the later understanding could not reverse. She said to him, in one of their final meetings, she was dying and she knew it, and she had asked to see him privately, not for any legal purpose, but simply because he was the person who had been most honest with her about her situation across the years of the widowhood, and she wanted to say something to that person before she was no longer able to. She said, "I needed to know before, not during." The knowing during is useful, but it is not sufficient, because you learn with the estate, and while you are learning, the estate is going, and what it goes to in the years of the learning cannot be recovered by the knowing at the end. He quoted her with her permission. She had told him in that meeting that if writing about her situation could be useful to anyone who came after, she gave him her blessing to do it. He wrote about her with the care of a professional who respected his client and the specificity of a man who had understood that what she had said was the most precise formulation of the central problem that he had encountered in 40 years of professional engagement with it. The formulation was before, not during. The learning had to happen before the inheritance. The inheritance happened once at a specific moment, and the patterns that formed in the months immediately after that moment were the patterns that defined the following years, and the years were not easily revised once the patterns had established themselves. The window for establishing different patterns was narrow, and the window opened at the moment of inheritance, and the woman who arrived at that window without preparation would find it closing before the preparation could be acquired. He continued the prudent woman conversation across the remaining years of his practice. He refined it and adapted it, and found better ways to frame specific concepts, and more effective ways to make abstract principles feel like concrete realities. He succeeded with some clients and not with others, and the ones he succeeded with were usually the ones who had some prior engagement, however minimal, however indirect, that gave the conversation something to attach to. The files he kept across 40 years of practice are preserved in a historical archive in Philadelphia. They are organized as the files of a professional office are organized, by client, by date, by document type. Reading them in sequence as the archive allows, you can follow the estates across time, can see the quarterly statements, can see the annual meetings, can see the moments at which the conversation Davies tried to have was had, and the moments at which it was deferred or deflected or absorbed without effect. You can see the estates at their beginning and at their end, and calculate the distance between those 2 points. The distance, in the majority of the cases that involved widows managing substantial estates without prior financial engagement, is a large number. The large number is the story, stated in the patient, precise language of figures. Davies did not believe the women in his files were failures. He was explicit about this in the memoir. They were, he wrote, the product of a system that had produced them without the relevant preparation, and had then placed them in a situation that required the preparation they did not have. The failure was not theirs, the failure was the system's. The women managed with what they had, and what they had was not sufficient, and the insufficiency was not their doing. He died in 1926, having managed the final settlement of the last estate in his active practice. The files were inherited by the firm that continued after him, and eventually found their way into the archive, where they wait in their patient organisation for anyone who wishes to understand the arithmetic of what happened in those houses and those families across those decades. The arithmetic is available. The stories behind the arithmetic are there too, in the quarterly statements and the meeting notes and the wills and the correspondence that legal files accumulate across the management of lives. It is quiet in the archive. The light comes through the windows at a certain angle in the afternoon, and falls on the files in their organised rows, warm and patient and entirely without judgment. The files contain what they contain. The numbers say what they say. And what they say, to anyone who reads them carefully enough to understand what they are reading, is the story of an education that was systematically withheld, and the consequences that withholding produced, told in the precise and unadorned language of columns that do not lie and totals that cannot be revised. When the final accounting was made, the estate settled, the documents filed, the lawyers paid, the process concluded, there was always something that remained that did not appear in the estate documents. Something that the numbers, for all their precision, could not fully measure or contain. Something that had been built with the fortune across the years of the widowhood, and that did not diminish when the fortune diminished, and that could not be divided and distributed along with the remaining assets, because it was not the kind of thing that could be divided or distributed. Eleanor Whitmore gave away approximately $1,400,000 across 23 years of widowhood. The institutions that received those gifts treated, in the years when they were operating at the capacity that her funding allowed, tens of thousands of people whose lives were measurably affected by the treatment. The hospital wing that her donation built housed patients who would otherwise have been turned away. The settlement houses furnace-heated rooms where immigrant families spent the winter in a warmth that was not incidental to their survival. The school for immigrant children on the Lower East Side educated students who went on to educate their own children, and their children's children in the particular compound way that education works across time. None of this appears in the estate accounts as an asset. In the estate accounts, it appears as expenditure, as the numbers in the columns that reduce the principal and the income and the eventual inheritance. The accounts capture the money going out. They do not capture what the money built when it arrived where it was going. The people treated are not in the accounts. The children educated are not in the accounts. The families that spent the winter warm are not in the accounts. The accounts are not designed to contain these things, and they do not. But those things were real. The people were real. The difference the money made in their specific lives was real. The reality of what the money built is not diminished by its invisibility in the document that recorded the building as a subtraction from the principal. This is the central complication that the purely financial narrative of these stories cannot accommodate, and it is a real complication, not a sentimental one. The mothers who diminished their children's inheritances did so, in most cases, in the service of things that were genuinely valuable. The hospitals were worth building, the settlement houses were worth sustaining. The art collections that were assembled with genuine intelligence and genuine passion have given and continue to give pleasure and meaning to everyone who encounters them. The sons who were supported through their repeated difficulties were real human beings whose needs were real, even when the supporting them was financially unwise. The genuine value of what the money built does not cancel the genuine harm of the depleted inheritance. Both are true. The people treated in Eleanor's hospitals were real, and the inheritance Eleanor's children did not receive was real, and the realness of one does not resolve the realness of the other into a clean moral verdict. This is the quality of these stories that makes them resistant to simple judgment, and it is also the quality that makes them most fully human. The quality of being about things that mattered in more than one way simultaneously, that were not mistakes and not entirely right, that produced both something good and something costly, without either cancelling the other. The children who received the smaller inheritances were not destroyed by the receiving. They were adults, with adult capabilities and adult resources of character and skill, and they made their adjustments and built their lives with what they had, which was in most cases sufficient for the basic requirements of decent living, even when it was not sufficient for the assumptions that the larger inheritance would have supported. But some of them, in the adjustment, learned things. Specifically, the daughters who watched most carefully. The Margarets, the Louises, the Franceses, who had tracked the small things and kept their observations to themselves, and who had understood, long before the estate attorney confirmed it, the direction that things were travelling. Those daughters became women who raised their own daughters differently, who had, in their kitchens and their drawing rooms, and the letters they wrote across the years of their children's formation, the specific conversations about money that their own mothers had not had with them, and that their mothers' mothers had not had with their mothers. The conversations about principal and income, about the difference between what an estate generates and what it can sustain, about the importance of sitting in the room where the financial decisions are made, not because you want to control everything that happens in that room, but because understanding what happens in that room is the difference between being prepared for your life and being unprepared for it. These conversations were not perfect. They were the conversations of women working with the partial knowledge they had acquired from painful observation rather than systematic education, transmitting that knowledge in the imperfect and partial way of oral tradition, without curriculum, without guarantee of completeness. The daughters who received them were better prepared than their mothers had been, not perfectly prepared, better equipped to ask the right question, to notice the significant number, to sit with the banker and understand what he was actually saying rather than the surface of what he was saying. The improvement was incomplete and was not the product of systemic change. That change came later, slowly, in the educational reforms and the legal changes and the economic shifts that eventually gave women the access and the tools and the standing to manage their own financial lives on equal terms. The women in these stories did not live to see those changes in their fullest form. They lived in the transition, in the years when the convention was beginning to erode at its edges without having been dismantled at its centre, and what they could pass forward to their daughters was what they themselves had managed to acquire, in the hardest possible school, from the experience that the convention had made necessary. This is the inheritance that did not appear in any estate document, and that accumulated across the generations that followed the diminishment into something that changed what was possible for the women who received it. It is the inheritance of the knowledge, imperfect and partial but real, that passed from the women who learned it too late to the daughters who might learn it in time. It is the inheritance of the understanding of what money is and what it requires, and what happens when those requirements are not met. understanding that was purchased at significant cost by the women at the centre of these stories, who paid that cost without intending to, and without knowing, until too late, the full price of what they were paying. The houses still stand, some of them, in the cities where they were built. The ones that have survived, a minority, the great majority having been demolished in the waves of development that swept the avenues in the early 20th century, have been repurposed. They are museums or hotels or apartments or offices, their rooms divided and their original functions replaced by the functions that contemporary life requires of large spaces in valuable locations. The carpets are museum grade now, or industrial, or simply the carpets that apartment residents install when they move in. The silver is in display cases or sold off or simply gone. The portraits hang where they hung in the original rooms, or in the museums that acquired them, or nowhere. Melted into the background of estates that were settled and divided and distributed too many years ago for anyone to trace the particular portrait to its particular room. The light is the same. This is the thing about light. It does not change with the room, does not adjust itself to the specific history of the space it occupies, does not fall differently on a room that once contained wealth than on a room that does not. It falls with the same patient warmth it has always had, through whatever windows the current configuration of the space provides, illuminating whatever the current inhabitants have placed in those rooms, entirely indifferent to what was there before. In the late afternoon, in any of those rooms, there is a quality of light that is older than whatever currently occupies the room. It is the same light that fell through those windows when the carpets were new, and the silver was polished, and the staff was full, and the estate was intact, and the woman who sat in the chair by the window had not yet opened the letter that had been waiting on the table for 2 weeks. It is the same light that fell through those windows in the years when the carpets were beginning to thin, and the silver was polished less often, and the staff was smaller than it had been, and the woman in the chair was looking out at the avenue, and thinking about dinner, and not yet facing what the letter contained. Patient light. Warm and unhurried. Not concerned with the arithmetic it illuminates or the stories the rooms contain. Simply present in the afternoon, doing the only thing that light does, which is to make things visible. So we return to where we began. To the house on the avenue, and the afternoon light through the tall windows, and the woman in the chair. She will open the letter eventually. She will sit with a banker in a panelled office, and look at numbers that will be clearer than she expected, and clearer than she wanted. She will have a conversation with her children that she will have delayed for longer than it should have been delayed, and the conversation will contain a revision of what the children expected, and the revision will require adjustment, and the adjustment will take time, or she will not open the letter. She will set it aside and will continue through the season, and will address the usual obligations in the usual ways, and the numbers that the letter contained will continue to be what they are, doing what they do, without her engagement. Either way, the light keeps falling. The house keeps standing for a little while longer, in the particular way that houses stand when they are held by someone who loves what they represent more than they can afford to. The carpets continue to thin at the edges. The portraits continue to look down from the walls with the composed authority of people who expected to be looked at and who are still being looked at. Outside, the avenue is quieter in the late afternoon than it was at midday. The traffic of the city's business has moved toward its conclusion. The light is doing its last work, the warm work, the work that turns ordinary surfaces into something that bears attending to. It falls on everything without distinction, on the things that have been maintained and the things that have been allowed to slip, on the evidence of wealth that is, and the evidence of wealth that was, with the same unhurried patience. There is nothing left tonight except the quiet. The house breathes, the light settles, the letter waits. Rest now. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you could go back and give one piece of financial wisdom to one of these women, just one simple lesson, at the very beginning of their widowhood, before any of it had happened, what would you say? Leave your answer in the comments. We'd love to know what you think.